Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the regular April meeting of the Concord Zoning Board of Adjustment. We'll follow our usual procedure this evening, which is to say we'll take the cases in the order in which they appear in the agenda. I'll ask the appellant to come forward and be sworn in, be seated in the chairs to my right, and offer any testimony that he or she would like us to hear. We ask that, if at all possible, the appellants confine their testimony to 10 minutes. We will then ask them to step down, and we will solicit testimony from anyone in the audience in favor of the appeal. Following that, anyone in the audience in opposition to the appeal. We ask that those audience members who wish to testify confine their testimony to 5 minutes. Following the public testimony, we'll check in with code enforcement to see if there are any comments from their office on the case. And then if any information has been offered that is...
still planning on arriving tonight?
Some people just have no idea how to handle a cell phone. It's terrible.
Okay. Rose understood that you were going to be here for...
Oh, you can plug your in. I can still hear you. Anyway, if anything has been offered that seems to bear factual clarification, the appellant will have the opportunity to offer that clarification, not new information, prior to our closing the public testimony portion of the hearing. Normally, the board will consider and act on each case in order as it is heard. Okay. It sounds like we're
very good.
A member short. Is he on his way, or?
No, he with miscommunication. He thought he wasn't needed tonight.
Aha.
So we're only going to have 4.
For this first case?
For the West Portsmouth Street LLC.
All right.
No. For the first one. For the Kevin Cheney case, we'll only have 4. That's right. We'll have 5 for the West Portsmouth Street. So.
All right. An unexpected development. We have only 4 members for the Kevin Cheney case.
Yeah.
Or Kevin Cheney, if Mr. Cheney or someone representing him is here, you have the opportunity to be heard tonight, but it would be by a 4-member board, and it would still require 3 votes for any motion to carry. Other than that, there would be no difference between a 4-member and a 5-member board, but the fact that you had a 4-member board would not be grounds for requesting a rehearing. Is Mr. Cheney here? Would you like to be heard by a 4-member board? All right, very good. Then come on up. This is case 1518, Kevin Cheney. The applicant wishes to remove and replace an existing non-conforming second detached dwelling and requests a variance to the multiple principal uses on a lot provision of the ordinance to permit 2 single-family detached dwellings on a single lot when no more than 1 single-family detached dwelling is permitted on a single lot for property located at 131 West Parish Road in an RO residential open space district. Gentlemen, do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Would you identify yourselves for the record as you testify, please?
Kevin Cheney.
What would you like us to know?
Well, I have an existing cottage, I call it, on the property, and just looking to demolish it and replace it with a new structure. I'm not quite sure how long it's been there, but at least, I'd say, 35 years.
Okay. Why do you feel a variance is justified? We have read your application, so you don't have to recite that word for word, but if you could fill us in on the high points.
Well, I just feel like it's already there. So they shouldn't. Yeah, when we bought the place, we wanted this building to be like an in-law apartment for my parents. That's the intention behind it. Also, I have 4 kids, so later in the future they might want to stay there for a while, or in the long term, it'll be my parents living there.
And the building is not salvageable as it is?
I don't think so. If not, the money it would take to bring it up to.
What's in it now? Is it just an empty shell, or?
No, there's it's a 1-bedroom, living room, bathroom, everything, kitchen in it. It hasn't been lived in for 15 years.
How much property do you have altogether?
It's 117 acres.
Other questions from the board?
Do you happen to know, was there a variance to put the current property there, or was that prior to the current code?
I don't know the answer.
I did some research on that, Andrew, and I was not able to find any specific records. So my assumption is it was created prior to regulations that would prohibit it.
And I'm just kind of scanning your diagrams, but you can probably answer faster than I can figure out, is it going to be a similar footprint?
Yep. Within a foot or two of it. Yep. That's the intent of it, to keep the same footprint.
1 bedroom?
I'm going to try to get 2 in it.
2.
Yep.
Nick, any questions?
None.
Rob?
No, sir.
Any other questions from the board?
No.
Is there anything else you'd like us to know?
No, unless you have some questions about the structure, that's what I'm here for.
Well, it sounds like the one question about the structure is it viable? And the answer was no. So.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the new structure.
Ah.
That he wants, the proposed new structure that he wants to put.
Well, we do have some sketches here.
Yeah.
Which I think fill us in on that. It's
Looking at,
the footprint is 33 by 21. What's the footprint of the existing building?
33 by 21.
It's exactly that.
Okay. Oh, I haven't any other questions. If the board hasn't any questions, I guess we're all set. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who would like to be heard in favor of this appeal? Is there anyone who'd like to be heard in opposition to it? Any comments from code enforcement?
Nothing to add.
With that, we'll close the public testimony portion of the hearing. We have a request to permit the demolition and reconstruction of an existing building on an existing footprint to create an in-law apartment. We heard testimony that the existing building predates the zoning ordinance and is in fact designed as a residence as it is. Discussion?
Well, we see in various forms that this type of thing all the time, and I think we tend to approve them if on the grounds that it's a reasonable use for this particular property, since they already have the structure there and they're simply trying to improve it, or in this case, just replace it. Their only alternative would just be to use a dilapidated building or let it go altogether, which would be, I think, unreasonable use. So I'd move to approve the variance.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? We got all, ayes all around. Anyone opposed? No nays? The vote is unanimous. The variance is granted. Next case this evening is case 17-18, West Portsmouth Street Solar LLC for LA Brushu Incorporated. The applicant proposes a 54-acre, 10-megawatt solar farm and requests... You want the paperwork back? Solar farm and requests a variance to Articles 28.4.1E, maximum lot coverage, and Section H, the Table of Dimensional Regulations, to permit a maximum lot coverage of 27.8%, where a maximum lot coverage of 10% is permitted for property located at 67 West Portsmouth Street in an RO residential open space district. Prior to hearing the case, the board has been requested to make a determination of whether or not a variance is required for lot coverage. Privately owned solar facilities are not a listed use under the table of principal uses. The zoning administrator, in accordance with Article 28.2.4E, administrative classification of uses not specified, has placed the use in the essential public utilities and appurtenances category, use K11, for zoning and planning review purposes. Gentlemen, may I swear you in? Promise to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me.
We do.
Would you identify yourselves for the record as you testify, please?
I'm Mark Trumbar with NextEra Energy. Jeremy Eggleton with Orr and Reno on behalf of the applicant. Joe Persino, Ty and Bond, engineer for the project.
And Kara Moody, TRC Environmental.
Since you have a two-part request of us, if we could address the first part first and then move on to the second, because in the event that we rule as you've requested, we would not need to discuss the rest of the case.
Thank you, gentlemen of the board. And I would like to, first of all, clarify that we were able to bring a lot more information back to you tonight. At the previous meeting, we had an application that was pretty tough to read, if you recall. It was, we tried to fit everything within the box, so to speak, on your application form. And what we did is we went ahead and made the font larger, which in fact spilled over to the other pages, which I think helps to really solidify what we're asking for tonight. So with that said, I would like to go ahead and let Jeremy address the issue with the impervious surface.
So I don't want to expand on what I've put in the memorandum. Obviously, we've spelled it out, and I assume you've all read the memo. So I don't want to get too deeply into it. I'll just touch on a couple of the high points for you in being mindful of our time. First, I want to say we appreciate that the language in question governing lot coverage has been interpreted consistently in the town thus far, or in the city, excuse me. What I would say, though, is that this project actually differs from most of the projects that the city has seen prior to this time. In fact, this is the first larger scale commercial solar project that we've seen. The only similar situation where there was the question of a variance was with the Unitarian Universalist Church on Pleasant Street, which sought a solar variance or a variance for a solar project and in fact received it. And I think the reason that we're asking this board to consider the definition of lot coverage in the specific realm of a solar project is because the city is favoring this kind of new infrastructure. And then on top of that, if the city has that goal, it's going to be very hard to meet those objectives if the zoning ordinance is read with this interpretation in mind. Just to give an example, this particular property is some 60 acres, and with a lot coverage requirement of at least 10%, or a restriction of 10%, in order to provide a 10 megawatt solar infrastructure of the kind that we're seeking here, you'd have to have a huge lot in order to accommodate it. And I don't know that there's a lot in Concord that would be large enough to fit it with the restriction in place. And that inherently is at odds with the allowable use. And it is an allowable use under the table of uses, even though it's not expressly stated. So you have a conflict in terms there, and I think it's within the power of the board to resolve that conflict, not just for this project, but in light of the city's expressed goals and objectives of fostering this kind of green energy development. I think that the board can take some comfort in the statutes which have been passed by the state legislature, which not just favor this kind of decision-making, but actually empower the board to interpret these ordinances in a way that expressly allows for alternative energy development. In RSA 672:1, subsection 3A, the state has required that the installation of solar, wind, and other renewable energy shall not unreasonably be limited by the use of municipal zoning powers or by the reasonable interpretation of such powers, except where necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And as I interpret that provision, certainly it's an expression of policy in favor of this kind of project, but beyond that, it really does empower you, if you believe this is a good project, to interpret the ordinance in a favorable way that allows this kind of project to go forward. So the gist of the substantive argument that we would make is that as defined in the ordinance, the minimum lot coverage requirement appears to be oriented towards preventing soil damage and runoff from accruing on a site. So if you've got lots of buildings and parking lots and structures that prevent water from being able to absorb into the ground, you're going to have stormwater runoff issues. Whereas solar infrastructure of the kind we're talking about, and you can all envision it in your minds, really sits on small posts. And our team is here to just talk about the technical aspects of that if you have questions on that. But the map right here really says it all. Looking left, in the left-hand portion, you have a satellite view which shows the panels obscuring the landscape and in a way that would be defined as the ordinance currently defines structures. And then on the right, we're looking at the coverage from the perspective that we would prefer to see in this case, where really the only thing that we're excluding would be the pieces of the structures that are actually set into the ground. Those are the only pieces that actually create impervious surfaces that prevent water from draining properly. Underneath these structures, the animals can live, the grasses grow, and it goes on.
If I could,
Yes.
just to make sure we're following this, but the code doesn't exactly say, at least doesn't clearly say why there's a maximum lot coverage, right? You're sort of inferring that from the fact that it talks about impervious surface, that the purpose of the lot coverage requirement it has to do with drainage, not so much with aesthetics.
That's right. I mean, that's my requested interpretation in light of the public policy imperative from the state and the empowerment of this board to make a decision of that kind. I think there's some ambiguity on that particular question, and in this case, it should be resolved in favor of the project.
But although our code doesn't address it, you cite here this commentary, and I think, I don't remember seeing it here, maybe I overlooked it, but you had previously said that other states have interpreted lot coverage in a similar way that you're advocating?
So the commentary that I cited was from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and it was guidance for their municipalities in interpreting these ordinances as well. And they recognize what lots of people are recognizing and what I think the city has implicitly recognized, which is that ordinances drafted without alternative energy infrastructure in mind are frequently hostile to it, just by virtue of, not by intent, but just by virtue of the way the language has been interpreted over time.
But prior to the whole solar issue, I mean the lot coverage requirements have been around along probably
Definitely.
50, 100 years, right? What's the origin of them, before solar? Why?
I can address that in a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then our team is ready to talk about the technicalities of it if you need further information on.
Does that bear on the question of lot coverage directly?
Just in the way that I've discussed,
Right.
the extent to which the physical infrastructure actually stops water from going into the ground.
Right. So as I understand it, these units sit on pedestals? Is it a single pedestal? per
So they
panel?
essentially sit on posts or piles.
Right.
And those are what are actually in contact with the ground. The only other infrastructure would be the electrical equipment, inverter pads, et cetera, and those would be sitting on concrete pads. So when you look at this plan in the black and white version of it, if you have the plan in front of you, but I can turn this over. When you look at that calculation of what's actually in contact with the ground ends up being about 2.5% compared to the 27.8% when you look at bird's eye view if these were actual structures in contact with the ground, which they're not. So when the panels are constructed, they're sitting on these piles or piers, posts, And, the front edge is about 2 feet off the ground, the back edge is about 8 feet off the ground. And they're not one continuous piece. They're broken up by smaller panels connected together, which has space in between them as well.
How big are they?
What's that?
Individual panels, how big are they?
It depends on the actual model selected for the property, or for this project, but on this, it'd probably likely be a, 3x6 type size unit, maybe a little bit different in size depending on the actual, product selected. And then there's typically, 1 inch, half-inch gap between all the panels depending on the racking system. So the water runs off and through, and then the vegetation, below is maintained. And you kind of take a look at the picture, which is, from actually somewhere out west, I think. So there's more different type of vegetation on that picture than out here, but the field out there would be maintained.
And your coverage, if you assume it's merely the posts rather than the panels, is what?
2.5%.
2.5%?
2.5%. So therefore, that's the whole rationale that we wouldn't be here for a variance if it's just looked at as impervious coverage versus.
And the 2.5% includes the electrical equipment?
It includes electrical equipment, it includes the roadways, it includes the existing buildings that would remain on site, which is a garage, and the incidental other impervious structures, and the posts. So oftentimes, we compare this to a fence. When you're calculating, lot coverage, fences aren't typically considered in this, because they're so de minimis. We have gone through the exercise of calculating the posts for each of the or the piles for each of these arrays, and that's what you come up with is 2.5%.
Okay. Craig, could you give us the benefit of your thoughts on your ruling?
Sure. Let me just hand out some information here. And hopefully, we can walk through this and I can explain how I've developed my position on this.
All right.
There should be a few extra copies to continue on to the applicant.
Just pass it around.
Andrew, I think there's a couple extra copies in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Come on, Andrew. I agree all that. Make us look bad.
Starvation corner down here.
I think you get it on one page.
Okay, so we have before us a section of the zoning ordinance from Article 28-2-2 onward.
Yeah, several sections here. So, when you're developing an interpretation, you need to look at the entire ordinance as a whole, not necessarily just one section. You try to get both the spirit and intent and the purpose of the ordinance out of it. So that's why I wanted to start here with, and this goes a little bit to your question here, Andrew, is the purpose of the lot coverage issue and why it is different between different zoning districts. And where this is the residential open space zoning district, previously known as agricultural districts and such, the intent of this district is to provide for open space areas, no more than 10% lot coverage on a lot. And the main purposes for that is to allow for your agricultural purposes, your forestry purposes, low impact outdoor recreational uses, and all this is outside the urban growth boundary. So there's not an expectation that we're ever going to have water or sewer for higher intensity type uses brought out here. In other words, it's supposed to be there for aesthetic purposes, vegetation, animals, wild animals, things of that nature that, and there's very few areas in the city. And that's why you got to look at this area as it is unique. But then we go and we look at, what's allowed in the district, and we've already established, or at least my interpretation has been, that it will fall under this use classification. That could be challenged too. But so we go down to the maximum lot coverage. And there's two sections here that you need to look at, because the first is just a 28.4.1 under our dimensional standards, where it says that no building, structures, or impervious surfaces, or combination thereof, shall be constructed on a lot such that the area of the lot covered by buildings, structures, and impervious surfaces, when calculated as a percentage of the total lot area, shall exceed the percentage as specified in the Table of Dimensional Regulations. Table of Dimensional Regulations is next, and that defines a total lot coverage of 10% is permitted. But then the key part is, what is a building, what is a structure, what is impervious, what is lot coverage versus open space. And that's all defined under the glossary. And you probably should start with a structure, because that's really what these are. And it's any combination of material assembled at a fixed location to give support or shelter, such as building, tower, framework, platform, bin, or the like. So really, these solar panels are, by definition, a structure. But if you go back in under building, the word building automatically includes the word structure, so they're essentially one and the same. And it is important to point out here, too, because we're talking about the fact that you don't count fences and such. The ordinance specifically excludes fences under this case, just for that reason. They say fences are not considered buildings or structures, because you don't. But this is a different type of structure. Then we look at, what is an impervious surface? Well, that's the surfaces within the lot which do not absorb water. It doesn't say foundation, it doesn't say footing, it just says surfaces, any surface. So whether it's a solar panel that is impervious, a 4x4 shed, a 12x12 shed. I mean, think about it. I have a 12x12 shed in my backyard that sits on piles. Water comes off the edge, soaks into the ground. But that 12x12 area is still considered an impervious surface area. And the same goes with the solar panels. You take a look at, let's see, did I put it in up here? Give me 1 second, because we do continue talking about Pleasant Street. Forgive me here. Now I'm forgetting where I put it. Well, I was going to show you a couple photos out of the Unitarian Church up at Pleasant Street. But when you look at that, again, and if you look at the panels here, even though they're maybe 7 feet wide as a horizontal cross section, they go on for 100 feet. So you're ending up with 7,700 square feet of impervious lot coverage there. And the rain doesn't hit the ground underneath them. I was up at the panels today looking at them, and it was raining fairly hard this afternoon, and looking at the ground underneath those panels, it was still dry. So that's why we say, it's the lot coverage is the area of a lot covered by the aggregate of the maximum horizontal cross-section of all buildings, exclusive of cornices, eaves, gutters, chimneys, bay windows, balconies, and such. So buildings, including structures. So that's what I say, maybe it is sitting on footings, but it's still covering that property. It's still not allowing water to reach the ground directly, or snow for that matter, or sunlight, or anything else. It's still creating an impervious surface. And then you look at, what is an open space? And that's an area of a lot unoccupied by buildings, structures, or impervious surfaces intended for environmental, scenic, or recreational purposes. So again, if we claim that these aren't creating lot coverage, it seems a little counterintuitive. Here's just an example of what a massive, field looks like. I mean, it just stands to reason. That's lot coverage. I mean, those are structures. That's different than the area over here where it's completely open. I mean, we just, again, this is larger than what they're proposing, but to me, I can't see that there's an argument that that is not covering the land, that it's not an impervious surface. So, questions, if you have anything, comments, I would be happy to address them.
Members of the board, questions for Craig?
So what do you make of so why did Massachusetts, was that just a sort of a solar specific decision that doesn't apply because we don't have a similar commentary, or why did Massachusetts make that decision?
I don't know why Massachusetts would have made that decision, but, there's two other points here then, because, again, it can't be specific to solar either. The ordinance has to be, and the interpretation and application has to be neutral. We can't say that solar panels have a special exclusion from lot coverage when if somebody put up a shed structure without a solar panel on it, it would be. It has to apply evenly across the board. And I think there was also a comment here made about changing the ordinance, or that the council has an intent on that. And it's also something to keep in mind because there is a potential for a change of ordinance, but it's not our ability to change the ordinance. If that's going to happen, it has to come from council and a different application or a different definition of what applies as lot coverage.
Other questions from the board?
Is it your interpretation that maximum, or the purpose of maximum lot coverage would shift depending on what district it's in, or
Absolutely.
it seems like, so where it's already contemplating open residential, the idea of runoff and things like that are less of a concern than it would be in more densely populated and maybe more geared toward agriculture or open recreational uses?
Exactly. In your higher density use areas such as the IN zone, the industrial zone, it has a much higher, I think it's an 85% lot coverage allotment in some place like that. In our downtown residential districts, it's 65, 75%. So it all depends on what the intended use of that district is and what we want to see in that location.
Putting aside the language in our code, why do we have lot coverage requirements in the first place? What's the purpose of them? Why did?
Well, I think if you look at the
first start establishing these.
Sure.
Like when?
In the sheets that I give you on a regular basis here, the back page of it goes to the purpose of the ordinance. And, some of the purpose here is to, well, you don't want to overcrowd land because you want to be secure from fire and safety and spreading, things of that nature. But again, you want to avoid undue concentration of population. We want to prevent the overcrowding of land. We want to lessen congestion in the streets. We want to make sure that we have adequate, provision of transportation, solid waste facilities, schools, parks. Depending on the different district, we have better roadways in the more urban district. We have water supply, we have sewage supply, we have drainage supply. So it's more designed for a higher density in lot coverage. But in the open space area like this, again, you want to preserve open space for recreational, agricultural, hunting, all these other uses that go on in our open space areas. So. And again, the master plan that the city and planning board put together and council adopts envisions that to be maintained.
So is it so your neighbor can't completely crowd his land because you don't want to look at all that stuff, or is it because there's just a lot of what you described goes to population? We don't want to overcrowd the population. Obviously, this doesn't affect the population. So does it have more to do with how it? I can understand why you can't have 100% lot coverage, and it's just from a viewpoint perspective, how it looks, or has it more to do with the demand on resources, municipal resources, because of too many people.
And well, it's what uses are appropriate for a particular location. Again, in a RO zone, residential open space, your expectations are pretty much what previously was on this property. That was all trees and shrubs and such like that. That's the intended purpose out there. You're not expecting to have a large scale, as Mr. Egger described it, a large scale commercial solar project, or a large scale commercial anything, whether it's solar, whether it be a factory, whether it be a 20-acre chicken coop. down there. It's just the bulk and mass of a building and structure and the use of the land. I mean, some people choose to live in denser populated neighborhoods. I do. You know, my neighbors are probably 15 feet from either side of my house. But other people choose to live in a district where they're guaranteed 40, 80 or more foot separation from their neighbors. And it helps guarantee that you know what you're getting into when you purchase your property. It protects your rights and what you're looking for. So.
Any other questions from the board for Craig? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just a brief rebuttal on some of those points.
Sure.
First, moving backwards, we need to remember that this use is appropriate for this zoning district. It's been determined to be so. Even though it wasn't expressly stated in the table of uses, it was found to be a utility, and therefore it is appropriate for the district. The idea that you could have a permitted use that can't actually be realized is anathema to the zoning ordinance. And that is the case here. If there's no way you could operate this infrastructure in an 85% industrial zone that was only 2 or 3 acres large. You need the space for this. And as we look at the city, it's very hard to find an actual piece of land where the lot coverage would allow you to do this as stated. With respect to the some of the issues that Mr. Walker had cited as being of concern with respect to lot coverage, Mr. Winters is exactly right. These issues focus on the ability of the city to provide infrastructure, whether there's population, schools, roads, things of that nature. Obviously, this project doesn't require any of those extra burdens on the city. To the extent that there's concern that by agreeing with us on this point, we're somehow not interpreting the zoning ordinance in a neutral manner. I think the legislature's actually decided that question pretty decisively. It has told you expressly that this kind of project you're allowed to actually favor. And so someone can't come in and say, well, look, there's a solar project over there and you allowed that interpretation of lot coverage there, and now I want to put my shed up. And you need to have the same interpretation here. And you can say, well, look, the legislature hasn't imposed a special requirement or a special consideration with respect to these solar project or sheds in the way that they have solar projects. Finally, looking at the glossary, lot coverage, I think when you look at the definition of lot coverage on the sheet that Mr. Walker handed out, you can actually see exactly what I'm talking about. It says, area of all buildings on a lot, exclusive of cornices, eaves, gutters, chimneys, bay windows, balconies, and terraces. And these are all items that stick out from the building, essentially, in which if you were looking down from the sky, would obscure the ground underneath in exactly the same way that these solar panels do stick out and shine up at the sky. And so if you look at those terms, the same exclusion should apply to the panels in this case. And just lastly, with respect to the observation about rainwater falling on solar panels, I just wanted our engineer to address that technically because it's outside of my experience.
Sure. So what we provided as part of the application was a reference to the hydraulic response of solar farms by Cook and McCune, which expressly goes through how solar panels, when properly, or solar farms, when properly designed, do not actually increase the rate of runoff for the site as you would if you were to, put impervious coverage across the entire lot in the same sense. They've done extensive studies on this. This is what other states such as Massachusetts, Maine, other New England states and throughout the country have kind of relied on, is the fact that the stormwater runoff from solar panels is not like a roadway or another impervious surface. When properly designed, there's sufficient space between the panels, sufficient space between the individual panels on the racks, which allows the water from one row to go underneath the row, in front of it, or the panel behind runoff to the panel in front of itself in the same rack. So you actually do get a very similar absorption of water, infiltration of water, as you would for a site that was just limited to the coverage by those piles or posts. Beyond that, like I said, when properly designed, we would be designing the site to make sure that stormwater runoff is accounted for the rest of the infrastructure on the site, including the coverage for those posts and piles, so the roadways, the electrical equipment, et cetera. So that shouldn't be a concern. And then lastly, yes, I just would like to kind of, again, touch on the definition of lot coverage that Jeremy has gone over, where it says exclusive of these cornices, eaves, gutters, and chimneys, which are not in contact with the ground, therefore allowing the soil to remain and vegetation to grow. With the solar farms throughout New England, we consistently have to maintain under them just like we would a normal field. In fact, they're mown twice a year in Maine. New Hampshire doesn't have solar farms of this size that we know of yet, but they're potentially coming. Massachusetts, it's the same thing. Very vibrant growth of vegetation below them. Wildlife, Kara can attest to. It functions much differently than a shed, which is in close proximity to the ground, doesn't allow vegetation to grow underneath it. Maybe you have some mice or something that live underneath the shed, but it's much different. It's not impeding stormwater runoff in the same way.
Thank you very much. I think with that, the board has enough information to address the question of whether or not we believe that the lot coverage requirement is exceeded or not on this particular lot based on the structures that are proposed. So, gentlemen, discussion. Nick, what do you think?
I am somewhat persuaded by the fact that these are, by definition, different than what a shed would do to a lot coverage or a fully enclosed building. I don't know.
I think I'm going to go along with Craig that the solar panels are part of the lot coverage.
I think I'm persuaded by the idea of the RO district being something other than just concern for impervious surface and runoff in this instance.
Andrew?
I think Craig made a very good presentation. But I think, if we study the language of the ordinance, it could be looked at from both sides. I mean, it clearly does not address this particular situation, the plain language of it. I think that, I think the most crucial word in the maximum lot coverage definition is the word cover. And there's no doubt it's an impervious surface, or I'm sorry, there's no doubt it's a structure, which could be a building, tower, framework, platform, bin, or the like. I mean, it's probably of all those closest to a platform or a framework. So it is an impervious surface. The question is, shall be constructed on a lot such that the area of the lot covered by. So the question is, does it cover? So I'm looking at the definition of cover. Put something such as a cloth or a lid on top of or in front of something in order to protect or conceal it. So in the instance of the shed, it might come, I don't know, half a foot at most off the ground, but it still probably covers it in that it really does conceal the ground. This doesn't cover it. It was like if I'm holding a lid over a pot, if I'm holding it, high enough off the air, I'm not really covering it. If I put it down on top of it, I'm covering it. So I don't think that they are impervious surfaces, but I don't think they cover the ground. So I think I would have to respectfully disagree with Craig. And I would vote that it does not require a variance.
As I look at it, I come back to what I think the intent of the lot coverage requirement for the RO district in particular was. RO is, as Craig pointed out, has a much lower coverage permissible than do other districts in the city. And one of the purposes for that is to maintain a certain amount of open space and limit the amount of constructed stuff there is on any given piece of property to a certain amount of that property in order to preserve, not just to protect water runoff, but also to protect the atmosphere of the place and the environment of the place. It is certainly true that critters can romp and plants can grow underneath solar panels, but not the same. It's not the same kind of arrangement as if the land were simply not covered at all, which I think is part of what the RO space was meant to have: open space, natural space, no construction on it. So I think it's a reasonable interpretation of coverage to say that, in this case, the solar panels, platform structures, whatever you choose to call them, are in fact contributing to coverage in this context, even though you could make an argument semantically that they don't cover it the way, if you actually built a conventional house, it would be covered. So although they may be able to manage the runoff issue, I don't think the spirit of RO as it's intended in the ordinance is met in this case. So I'm inclined to agree with Craig as well, I think. Does anyone care to make a motion? Don't all jump in at once.
Have to make a motion that,
You would have to make a motion upholding the code enforcement administrator's interpretation of lot coverage in this case, I think. Correct?
Yeah.
I'll make that motion.
All right. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
Nay.
The vote is 4-1 with Mr. Winter in the minority. We will hear the rest of the request for variance.
With the determination that you've just made, we would respectfully request a variance of the lot coverage for the parcel in hand. As a part of the solar developments that we're seeing going on in New England, we are finding the rural areas are the most adaptive for the proposed use that we're looking at. We're using large, expansive areas that we're able to have connectivity to transmission. And in many cases, the lots that you see as you're driving down the road just simply don't work because they don't have adequate transmission. Contrary to what everybody thinks, solar energy has to stay affordable, okay? We have to remain marketable for the people of New England. And so when we're looking at sites, we're looking at sites that are first of all, expansive enough to have projects that are 10 to 20 megawatts in size. Secondly, we're looking for sites that are close to transmission facilities so that the cost of the facility doesn't skyrocket, and we can afford to put that out for the citizens of the area to consume. So those two things add up really quickly. And so when we're looking at sites, this site that we're looking at is perfectly situated for the proposed use that we're looking at. The lot coverage variance that we're seeking, the 10% is what you guys have in place for the district. We're looking at going to the 27.8% on that with this proposed use. Hopefully, we respect the decision that you've made before, but we would hope that since this lot is situated for the use that we have at hand, that you would find in favor of the proposed spatial or this proposed variance that we have in front of you.
With respect to the specific requirements for a variance, the hardship requirement is obviously the most important one from your perspective, I assume. And there are special conditions of this property which do make the application of this provision of the ordinance a hardship in this instance, and they include the fact that this lot, again, is zoned in a district where this use is permissible, and yet in the same zoning district, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find a lot where the use in question would actually be permitted as a consequence of the lot coverage. In addition, the lot itself has proximity to a commercial, to electric infrastructure already, which renders it ideally suited for connection to the grid. And most importantly, it's already been cut. I mean, there are no trees left on the property because it was a commercial farm at one point, a commercial nursery. As a consequence of that, you don't have to do any felling of large amounts of trees in order to accommodate a solar project. So if we were to locate a lot, perhaps up in the direction of Hopkinton, that was 300 or 400 acres in size, which would permit this kind of project on the 10% allowable lot coverage in this kind of zoning district, you'd end up having to cut down 30 or 40 acres of trees in order to accommodate the project itself, possibly more. So these are special conditions of this property that make it uniquely suited to this kind of project. The application of the zoning ordinance, given these special conditions, is such that it does impose an unnecessary hardship. If this project isn't allowed to go forward on the basis of the lot coverage restriction, then essentially it's difficult or impossible to allow it anywhere in this zoning district. With respect to the public interest as defined by the zoning ordinance, the purpose of the ordinance here in Concord includes, among other things, to assure the proper use of natural resources, which this project intends to do because it intends to generate power through solar energy. And this obviously also furthers, or from our perspective, it furthers the objectives of promoting public safety, convenience, comfort, aesthetics, prosperity, health, and the general welfare. It meets the objectives of the city with respect to these kinds of projects. Furthermore, as I noted previously in our discussion about the interpretation of the ordinance, the state has weighed in on these issues, and it has expressly asked you to interpret these ordinances in a way that allow these kinds of projects to go forward. And so with respect to a zoning request for a piece of land where a project is allowed, but as interpreted, it would be impossible to do the project, then we suggest that that is exactly the kind of situation that the legislature was contemplating when it imposed that mandate on boards like this. I addressed the question of whether it was consistent with the intent and spirit of the ordinance. Purposes of the ordinance definitely support this, and the objectives of the city definitely support this kind of project because we are have a mandate from the people of Concord to pursue these kinds of projects. Substantial justice is done in this case. The question of substantial justice and whether it's done with the granting of a variance is essentially whether the variance being granted will not cause harm to the public that outweighs the benefit to the applicant. And here, given that the city has weighed in on this and said we want these kinds of projects, the harm to the applicant would be outweighed by any impact on the public by the granting of the variance. And then the value of the surrounding properties will not be diminished. For the most part, the surrounding properties are on a quiet bend in the Merrimack River. Across the river is undisturbed woodland heading up to the prison area. And next to it, there are a few residences in the area, and it's generally an undeveloped space. So there's certainly no evidence that the solar infrastructure would impact the value either of these homes or the property across the street.
Questions from the board? Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
If you would step down? Oh, sorry. And would you mind moving the easels so that people coming up can see their way clear to the chairs? Maybe put it over to the side here where it's still, the poster's still visible. Is there anyone who would like to be heard in favor of this appeal? Is there anyone who'd like to be heard in opposition? Would you come forward, please, sir? Yep. Over to the right would be great. Swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
Yes, I do.
May we have your name as you testify, please?
Len Brochu II, owner of the property.
What would you like us to know?
The parcel, you know, I've heard, I was out of the country last time we had this discussion. And people bring up that it's farmland that we're trying to take over. We've owned it since the late 70s. And there was a pine grove there that someone was growing for pulpwood. And there were maple trees in the back portion, you know, swamp maples. My father cleared that, and we grew a field that we used to have the Good Roads parties on, and other than that, there was nothing else. It wasn't rich enough to grow anything. And we've tried for years and years and years. We get leaf compost, and we plow 800 yards of compost into the field every year. And the front portion was a cornfield, maybe 12, 15 acres in the very front along the road. And that's the portion that we've tried to build up. And my father's been gone for 10 years. And for 15 years, we've been thinking what we could do with the property. We had red pine, 20 acres that a borer came in, ruined the crop, had to get rid of it, ended up costing me $30,000. Talked to different farm people what we could do with it. We could plant raspberries. We could grow Christmas trees. I'm in the business of growing trees. For the past 3 years since I've been negotiating this deal, I own the 3 houses directly across the road where it's about 15 feet higher, and that's the real farmland over there. The city owns half of it, and the farmer owns some, and I have about 15 acres. So we've moved most of my trees over there. And something that would take 8 years to grow on this other field, I have grown in 2 years in this other soil because the soil's so much better. So I have a piece of land that has not a lot of use. And if you look at it, I know they've touched on it, but no one wants it in their backyard. And like I said, I own 3 of the houses across the street, and there are 2 other residences. And if they don't want to live there, if this was built, I'd buy the houses from them. But you don't want it in your backyard, and there's only 2 houses that would be able to see this. Did I mention I grow trees? There'll be all kinds of trees screening. No one will be able to see this except from a helicopter or a drone. So I don't see where it affects anybody. It's a benefit to the city. It's a benefit to me. I have current land use. Don't pay much taxes for that piece of property right now. It gets pulled out of current land use when this gets made. There's no demand on the infrastructure. You don't need to make new schools. You don't need to put new roads. You don't need to put new sewage in. There's no demand on the city, and the city benefits from the extra taxes that would be brought forth. So it's a win-win for everyone. I've owned that since I was in high school with my father. There are all kinds of deer that get pushed down there because everyone else is developing their land. We don't want the deer. I have permission to kill them whenever I want because they're hurting my crop. By putting these in, they can run wherever they want and nothing's gonna stop it. So that's open space. They're not gonna be harming my crop. It was brought up about impervious structures. And I've dealt with planning board, and I've dealt with development, and I've dealt with the city dumping water into Horseshoe Pond, flooding my nursery on Commercial Street. And the big topic is impervious, hard impervious, which creates runoff. If I put a tent up 10 feet in the air and the water comes down and it drains in the ground and does not run off, it is not created impervious to the lot.
I think we're wandering a little bit from the.
Well, I'm
From the
having my
point here.
chance to talk about everything a little bit, so I apologize, but I'm in favor for it.
Okay.
But, I mean, and I know we're past the impervious, but,
We're also past the 5 minutes.
oh, I wasn't told I only have 5 minutes, thank you. But, you know, I would like it, you know, it would help the city out, it would help me out, and I don't see it as a problem for anyone, so, thank you.
You're welcome. Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard in favor? Is there anyone who'd like to be heard in opposition? Please come forward.
Hello,
Hello.
my name is James Thorpe. I live directly across the street from
You
the...
swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, Mr. Thorpe?
I do. I live directly across the street from the proposed land. When I purchased my property and house, what drew me to it most was the expansive and open field to the entire dead-end street that it rests on.
Where do you live relative to the property?
68 West Portsmouth Street.
Okay.
Which is,
There you go, right? Yep. I believe that's the house right there.
68 right here.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Okay, and the solar array would go,
Directly across the street, yeah.
Right in this area here.
okay.
The RO Open Space District is exactly what I was looking for, and I purchased with that in mind. I made a choice. By making zoning changes and disregarding the current zoning and bylaws, my choice would be taken away. A change to the variances surrounding me will fundamentally shift my experience with the land and the property I fell in love with. I cherish where I live, and I do not want to leave. Ironically, though, if I did want to up and leave to find a new place, I'd be hard-pressed to sell my house and find someone who wants to live within a commercial industrial setting with 54 acres of solar panels as a view from their porch. The value of the surrounding properties, financial and emotional, will certainly be reduced with any zoning changes in this proposed installation. The variance that concerns lot coverage within a residential open area specifies no more than the 10% coverage. This is for good reason. If we consider the entire drip edge of the solar panels, that 10% coverage is far exceeded. And by the way, we must consider the entire drip edge. With this in mind, the natural sunlight will not be able to reach the ground underneath the panels. The rain won't fall, find a natural and even broadcast to the land. It will now be directed to the lowest slope of each panel, resulting in erosion of the land that is, by the way, already precarious, considering it's a floodplain for the Merrimack River. Directly across the street from my house on the proposed land, there's a 10 to 15-foot drop into the floodplain. The idea of a commercial installation of solar panels, regardless of how green the resulting energy remains, would be undermining the natural shaping and shifting our land and waterways in accordance with each other, have been slowly making over thousands of years. Let us not take that lightly. Concord, New Hampshire is so unique in that it offers an attractive and vibrant downtown setting in balance with this beautiful, open, expansive rural outskirts. Many Concord citizens have been stunned visiting my property, stating, "I never knew this was Concord. This land is amazing. It's so quiet and natural here." An unattractive industrial eyesore changes the entire face of the landscape of this pastoral, cultural, and residential road. Therefore, the view and perspective of Concord citizens changes. We won't be happy with what we see and conditionally how we treat our town, how we speak about it to others. The zoning and changes to possible land use should be significant to any Concord citizens. I truly identify with that. What is much more significant to me personally, though, is the fact that I have a 5-year-old daughter, Matilda. She is everything to me. She and I use our quiet dead-end road daily to pull sleds on, ride bikes, walk the dog. Our natural behaviors such as these will unfortunately change with such a drastic adjustment to our setting. What's much more concerning is that our house sits close to the road, and we would be spending majority of our day within 100 feet of this 10 megawatt solar farm. I cannot allow my daughter to be exposed to the electromagnetic energy surrounding a massive industrial installation like this. On top of that, the radiation generated by the conversion of energy is not something I'm willing to live so close to. Due to this solar energy being relatively new to us, there are no long-term studies or research to access that focus and document human health while living in close proximity to such immense and concentrated solar energy systems like this. I won't be able to sleep at night knowing I allowed my daughter, still in the early stages of development, and I to be guinea pigs of such exposure. Should I plan on recording our day-to-day health, writing down symptoms that we notice in the future, and wonder if they're related to such concentrated energy fields in close proximity to our home? Should I then weigh the options of contacting an attorney to support me through such times? No. As a Concord resident and taxpayer, no. As a mindful father, no. I shouldn't have to worry about that. I truly hope you board members that will be deciding the future of this case can understand that. As I stated at the onset, I believe in green energy. This municipality should be considering long-term sustainable ways to gather energy, to make progress within our town, and to allow for the safest and most fulfilling civic engagement and appreciation as possible. This proposed case, this enormous and imposing 54-acre, 10-megawatt industrial installation, with no available credits to Concord citizens, by the way, placed very closely to homes in a residential area, falls far short of that delineation. Thank you for your time.
Any questions? Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to be heard in opposition? Please come forward.
Hello.
You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
May we have your name, please?
Caitlin Sapak? Caitlin Sapak.
What would you like us to know, Ms. Sabar?
So, first of all, thank you guys so much for your time tonight. I am here to talk opposed to the solar field.
Do you live nearby?
I do. I live right across the street next to Mr. Thorpe, 72 West Portsmouth Street, so we're the other house, directly across. My fiance and I, we just purchased that home this past June. We fought tooth and nail for it. Buying a house is a lot more stressful than I thought. So we bought that house and we intend on staying there for quite a while. We bought that house wanting to start a family there. And though we love the house itself, one of our biggest draws to it was the land around it and the residential ordinance. That was a huge, huge selling point for us and why we went through, so much of the hassle we did in purchasing this home. Of course, we would much rather see the open space there as opposed to 54 acres of solar panel. And we do intend on starting a family, so eventually we would move there and selling our home. That is a concern of ours. As Mr. Thorpe said, everyone that we have visit our home is always in awe. They didn't know that this was part of Concord and how beautiful it is right by downtown Concord. And that's something we're still in awe about. My fiance and I drive down that road every day, just I can't believe we live here. I can't believe this exists. One of my huge concerns is just the health impact with such a large solar panel. As I did state, Chris and I, we do intend on starting our family there. And just the concerns, I searched, I tried to find, you know, any place that a solar panel would be that close. As you can see, oh, sorry.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I would be able to throw a rock and hit the solar panels from my home. And with it just being that magnitude and that close, that absolutely concerns us for that long. I know we plan on living there for at least a decade, again, starting a family there, so that's a huge concern of ours. Another concern is, you know, just the abundance of wildlife we have there, just the natural landscape, how that's going to be affected after 2 decades. I'm still not clear on the impact it's going to have or the benefits it's going to have just solely on Concord. I haven't heard, you know, how that's going to benefit solely Concord. So sorry. So with all of these factors, it definitely has us concerned, especially after buying our first home. And I ask that, you know, please.
Thank you very much.
Would you accept, my fiance was not able to attend today. Would you take a letter?
Of course.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Sear.
Pardon, first?
Bill Sear. I live at.
Would you like us to know, Mr. Sayre?
Craig is available for putting up a solar farm.
In this case, it's irrelevant.
Okay, so I'm trying to see how that's a hardship. And another question I had is I don't know what the floodplain, how the floodplain would affect the level.
We have not been asked to consider that. That would be a code compliance issue, but we are not being asked to forgive.
But we're talking about them being 3 feet off the ground on the low side. I didn't know if that was in the floodplain or not.
It is, I believe that land is in the floodplain, but it's not, it doesn't bear on our discussion tonight.
But just, yeah, the electrical components and such would be designed and put at a level that would be required for the base flood elevation, so that they would be above the base flood elevation. I believe the panels, at least the panels themselves, would also be above the base flood elevation, although the footings would be below the flood elevations.
Okay. And going towards the aesthetics, in all the pictures we've seen, we're looking at the front side of these solar arrays. And the 2 houses across the street, they're going to be looking at the back side of these panels, which is not nearly as aesthetically pleasing. And I have 1,800 feet of frontage with the Brochu property. From my porch, I could see through the woods, especially this time of year, and I can see the land out there. I harvest my own firewood. If I was to thin that to any level at all, I'd be looking right at the sides of this solar farm, and that doesn't please me too much. And just to echo some of what the other people said, I bought this place 5 years ago, and it was a struggle to buy it. And when I bought it, it wasn't for the house. The house was in poor condition. There was junk all over the property. It's 27.5 acres, and I've been working on it ever since, cleaning it up. But again, I didn't buy it for the house. I bought it for the area, for the land that came with it, and this would totally disrupt that. And the other point I would like to make is we're arguing like 10% and 27.8%, but really, if you put that size of solar array out there, it doesn't seem like you're doing 27.8%. It looks like 80% of that property would be covered with a solar array.
Well, the board has already ruled that that's the case.
80%?
Well, I don't know about 80%, but
okay.
we've ruled that it's a coverage issue.
Okay. And the other issue is like the roadway, are the roadways counted in that percentage?
Yes.
Okay. And are they paved roadways?
I don't know. We'll get the appellant to tell us the answer to that.
Okay, because if they're not paved, you could consider that impervious or not impervious. And
They did testify that the roads were included in their calculation.
right, but my point is, if it's a gravel road, you could argue that that's not impervious.
They didn't argue that.
But
Well, I should say that, you know, the interpretations have been that dirt roads, driveways and such like that, hard packed, are considered impervious surface.
Which is what I'm getting to. Maybe and I don't know what drove the zoning ordinance to begin with, but when that 10%.
We wonder that sometimes.
Right. But when that 10% was put in place, and it's counting structures and whatnot, and it counted roadways, they couldn't foresee that a solar panel, that wasn't even on the drawing board at that point.
You're quite right.
But I'm sure at that point, they weren't thinking of 80% of the area being filled with solar panels and saying, well, we're only counting the posts, or we're only counting just each panel, we're not counting all the area around the panels. I wouldn't believe that to have been the case.
Well, the board has ruled that they have a coverage issue.
That's all I have.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard? Comments from code enforcement?
Just a couple things I wanted to comment on. One of the themes that was repeated several times was the fact that the state RSAs, discuss, any unreasonable limitation to solar panels by zoning ordinance. And again, the zoning ordinance does not prohibit zoning or solar panels. It's not an unreasonable prohibition against them. They are permitted within reason, and it depends on the zoning district, and they're treated no differently than any other structure in any other zoning district. And I would point out that the other side of that is that there's also significant RSAs about the protection of agricultural land and open space. I think the key issues here that need to be considered, and I'm sure you'll discuss them, are the hardship. What's unique, what's special about this property that differentiates it from the other property in that area that, if a variance is granted for this, why wouldn't it be suitable to be granted for the other land down in Portsmouth Street? And then, again, the spirit and intent of the ordinance, which, again, when I gave you the open space definition there and purpose, that outlines some of the spirit and intent of the ordinance. I think that's important to be considered this evening, too. So, thank you.
Mr. Eggleton, would you like to offer any response, any factual clarification in response to what you've heard?
I'd like Mark to speak on there was discussion about electromagnetic fields and things of that nature, and I think Mark's probably better.
Mark Trummer from Next Era Energy. During the discussion from the folks that live close to the solar field, of concern is health, safety, and welfare of citizens. We have workers that work on a daily basis within the solar array itself, probably being closer to these arrays than anybody. We would not subject any of our workers to any sort of ill will or area that would be unsafe. Solar panels have been around for a long time. I don't think that you're going to find, there's many studies out there that talk about what happens with the solar array if it causes, certain ailments or whatever else. I work underneath of a solar panel 10 feet above me. Now, I can't attribute this to that, but from the standpoint that, solar panels are around, and we're not getting ill from them right now. So the other thing that we want to talk about is that during the site plan process, which this would have to go through yet, there are certain things that we can do about compatibility. Mr. Brochure even brought up the fact that he has certain trees that we could plant. Obviously, they don't do very well there. We're going to have to foster that growth along with fertilizer or whatever else, but we can promote compatibility by planting and screening and doing those sorts of things. And also regarding the use of the property, Mr. Brochure brought up tonight that the use of the property is pretty limited. you can't grow a pretty good, a decent crop there. It's pretty limited in its nursery capacity. A solar field does belong there. And again, this is close to the transmission that we're proposing to interconnect to. Unitel is who we're working with this on already. So we think it's a very good use of the property, and we would urge you to grant the variance that we're requesting.
Could you talk about the potential for Concord itself to take advantage of the energy?
Yeah, as a part of this project, we do have a portion of it that we could carve out for the city of Concord if they deemed that this would be something beneficial to the community.
It might be a public policy issue, but it's not a zoning issue.
Right. Okay. We're just responding to the comment.
So, I mean, I heard some conflicting things about whether you can put a screen up. I mean, the neighbors said they'd be looking right at it. Mr. Brochu said he could plant trees. You said you're not sure if it's possible to sustain them there. I mean, can you make a condition of a variance that you can put up evergreens?
I think from the standpoint that I said that they have a tough time growing trees there, we're going to have to work extra hard on screening with natural vegetation, especially if you're talking about maybe some of the eastern white pines or some of the pines that may grow better there. We've got a built-in resource with the gentleman that owns the property right now on what does grow and what doesn't grow. Obviously, we'd be looking at something that would not be deciduous. We would be looking at a combination of both deciduous and coniferous trees that would be suitable to screen those. The landowners that live on West Portsmouth Street do look over the proposed facility. There is a drop there, so there's a natural drop off of the road as you come into the site. So we're already working with a 6 to 8 foot drop in the ground. We could plant trees closer to the toe of the slope that will do a very good job of blocking that the backside of the panels as somebody was discussing tonight. So, thank you.
I might just make mention too that as part of the planning board site plan approval for the project, these aesthetic issues and the other issues, you know, can certainly be addressed. We're here tonight to really address the issue of the variance with relation to lot coverage.
And on that point, the question of what the special conditions of the property are that would render the literal application of the ordinance a hardship in this case. If you look to the Unitarian Universalist decision, which this board granted a variance in that case, the special condition that the board identified as justifying the variance was the existence of a spiritual garden behind the church. So it was a creation of the applicant itself, where they had erected a memorial garden. I think it was for, I don't know if it was church members or, you know, what the circumstances were, but it was a special thing in the back that prevented them from putting their solar array behind the church instead of in front of it. And this board found that condition justified the grant of the ordinance.
I think we're into new territory here, Mr. Eggleton, which is...
Sure.
Which is not quite cricket, so let's...
No, I concede that this is a different kind of project, but again, that's the only reference we have.
I mean, in terms of your argument, that this particular testimony is just for factual clarification.
I was responding to the statement about what the special conditions are that need to be focused.
Right, which is something you should do in your initial proposal to us, or presentation to us.
In any event, we feel that the special conditions do justify the grant of the variance in this case. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We did receive a letter from Christopher Martineau. I have run through it. It's available in the record for anyone to read. The board members have copies. It in substance, is very similar, if not identical, to Caitlin Zabar's testimony. With that, we will close the public testimony portion of the hearing, and I invite the board to discuss the case. We have representation made to us that the lot is uniquely suitable for this particular use because of its unsuitability for certain kinds of agriculture and the fact that it has been already cleared. We also have testimony that the use would not be possible anywhere in this district because of this restriction, other than on a very large lot, which is not available. And we have already discussed at length the issue of coverage. I don't think we need to discuss that. I think that's, the board's views on that are fairly clear. So, gentlemen. Andrew, you want to dive in?
Well, I'm going to try to disregard my previous, viewpoint in that, I'll accept the board's ruling, and try to look at this strictly from the variance perspective. So therefore, I kind of have to accept just for this purpose that the purpose of the lot coverage requirement does have to do with aesthetics. Obviously the neighbors said a lot of stuff, but I think a lot of it does boil down to the atmosphere, and it would change their atmosphere. So I'm just caught up on. I don't think we have clear facts from anyone on exactly what it's going to look like from their side of it. Mr. Brochu said they won't see anything. The applicants talked about putting up a screen, but they weren't really clear on how they intended to do that. They said it would go in front of the planning board, but in past cases we've dwelled a lot on making sure there was a condition of adequate screening.
We certainly did with the Unitarian Church.
Yeah. And in the other solar case we had a few years ago, that was a big issue as well. So, I mean, I definitely see their claim of hardship in that if it, and we haven't heard any evidence of it otherwise, that this lot can't be used for agriculture. It doesn't really have any other good use. Does anyone disagree with that?
I didn't hear testimony that it didn't have any use that was permitted by right in there. If that's, are you getting to the governing now?
No, that it doesn't have any function. It doesn't have any, according to, it doesn't have any practical use. Isn't that what they were saying?
We did hear some testimony that certain things won't grow there very well.
What's this a picture of?
That's the picture of the fields there. These are all trees growing over in this section. These are shrubs and bushes, bark mulch back down there.
Oh, this is the lot in question?
Yeah.
Oh, you just got closer in.
Whoops. I'm going the other way. But yeah,
things grow, but they take a lot longer to grow.
Well, this is wintertime. These are all trees here. Everything that you see here is wall-to-wall tree.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Well, I agree that I think reasonable use of that property has been pretty much exhausted. Yes, you can grow trees on it, but we heard testimony that it takes, 4 times as long to grow a tree there than it does across the road. So I think the hardship issue is partially arguable in the fact that reasonable use has not been realized, or can't be realized in this current form of agricultural potential.
However, other uses could be. It doesn't have to be agriculture. RO does allow other uses.
Such as?
Residential.
Good.
Correct? Which we have. Across the street.
Yeah, it's a floodplain. Residential, but raising of livestock, poultry, any other type of...
Yeah, there are other uses. I'm not...
There are other things you can use in that zone. Yeah. I just think that it's, for the amount of solar panels that they're going to put on, it's just going to maximize the coverage too much.
I can see both sides of a lot of the variance requirements. Kind of the idea of the spirit of the ordinance being observed kind of comes into the interpretation that we just made, certainly a little bit. The essential character of the RO district seems like it has both sides can be seen. The idea of promoting environmental sustainable power, but with that being placed in an area that looks as open as we've seen, seems to kind of have the purpose on one side conflicting with the kind of aesthetic or the general character on another side. And whether substantial justice is done, I think the benefits to the applicant are pretty big here. We've heard testimony that there's a lot of concern over what that's going to do to other individuals in the immediate vicinity.
What do you take of their argument that there aren't that many lots that would be close enough to the energy source to connect in that would have this much open space where they could otherwise do it?
I think that, and we often hear this type of argument, is suggesting that there may be a flaw in the ordinance, not necessarily a justification for a variance. We've confronted this before, and it's a tricky situation because sometimes when the ordinance, one of the reasons why variances are possible is because the ordinance doesn't apply fairly in every case. That's why we exist, this board. At the same time, this is something that's not addressed in the, by solar panels, is not addressed in the ordinance. And I think the board has found, to my satisfaction anyway, certainly, that these are a structure, notwithstanding the fact that they're solar panels. If they were going to be used for something else, it wouldn't change the way I looked at it, particularly. The fact that it's very difficult to do it's difficult to do other things in Concord too that we might find desirable, but that's not for the board, I don't think, to decide, at least not in this context. And I'm inclined to agree with Rob that
just goes back to lot coverage.
This is going to be a big piece of construction out there. It's going to totally change the character of that space, and I do put a lot of stock in the ability of people who make certain important decisions based on what the law says, in this case the zoning ordinance, being able to rely on those in the future. As we're not talking about a minor change here. We're not talking about something that can be hid with a few bushes. And we're not talking about something that's you drive by at 35 miles an hour. It's going to be something they're looking right at. So I think I may be giving away my position on this, which is that I'm inclined to oppose it. Although we do have an issue here. If the city of Concord wants to have solar farms within its boundaries, then I think it's going to be something the planning board and the zoning, or excuse me, the city council are going to have to address in their land use study. And we got a whole new zoning ordinance about to be cooked up. We have an opportunity to do that, but I'm disinclined to start that process by granting a variance for this particular installation. The other solar installations they're homeowner stuff that we've looked at. They're
massive.
They're much smaller and much less intrusive and don't really change the character of the neighborhood in my mind. This would.
But to shift that to council, because so then council would have to say rezone an area to allow it, and then they'd have the same issue with neighbors coming in. Well, there's not a spot in Concord where somebody wouldn't, have a similar gripe.
But it is a policy issue, and it is, zoning board has the authority to look at the zoning ordinance and make determinations based on the enabling legislation to grant a variance. But a board has to be very careful that they aren't trying to establish policy. That has to be through council.
This is our zoning regulations, so we kind of have to.
Right. Do we accept that this lot is unique compared to the surrounding lots? That they can't, that the agriculture really is not commercially viable here? You know, I mean, they could put a house there, but it's not.
I mean, it is agricultural and they can grow something.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's set up for residential. I mean, could they put? I mean, how much would have to go into it? It's not.
It's in the floodplain, they could build on it.
Mr. Brochu did make the point that he had a hard time growing things there, but that actually wasn't part of the appellant's presentation. Their rationale for it being a unique lot didn't have to do with the fact that it couldn't be used for something else. And I'm reluctant to overlay that on this. I don't know that for a fact. And I can imagine other uses there, but I don't know for a fact that there is any other plausible use. Certainly, everyone who, I think, agrees that when the ordinance was written, nobody imagined this particular use in any lot in Concord.
I don't think we have to exclude all plausible use. It's simply hardship exists when special conditions render the lot reasonable. Special condition.
And hardship's not the only thing they have to meet.
Well, of course, yeah.
Yeah. And I think the spirit of the ordinance and the intent of the ordinance is not to have that kind of development on that property in an RO district. So even if they met hardship, I couldn't say they met all the other criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've all had our say-so. Does anyone care to make a motion?
Why don't you go ahead, Chris?
Chair doesn't make motions. It's bad manners.
Ah.
Not to say that I'm not capable of bad manners, but not tonight. Anyone else?
I'll move to deny the variance.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second it.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the motion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed?
Nay.
The vote is, did you vote aye?
I voted aye.
Okay, the vote is 4-1 with Mr. Wallner in the minority. The variance is denied. That's a tough one.
Yeah, sure.
Which is why we spent so much time on it.
At least we did. At least we did spend a lot of time.
Yeah, I think we did our job.
Justice to it, yeah.
The next case this evening is case 1118, Irving Oil Marketing Incorporated. The applicant wishes to reestablish and expand a retail store and a retail fuel station and requests the following. A variance to Article 2824J, the table of principal uses, to permit the retail sale of gasoline in the UT urban transitional portion of the property. A variance to Article 2877G, parking, setbacks and restrictions, to allow off-street parking to be located in the front of the building, between the building and the street. And variance to the table of dimensional regulations to permit a total lot coverage of the portion of the lot in the UT district of 80%, where a maximum lot coverage of 75% is allowed. And finally, a variance to Article 2842E, buffers for district boundaries in collector or local streets, to permit a 30-foot plus or minus wide driveway to cut through the buffer zone where a 15-foot vegetative buffer is required. For property located at 163 North State Street in a CU Urban Commercial District and 22 and 24 Pennacook Street in the UT Urban Transitional District. Note, the three lots are intended to be merged into a single lot transected by the CU and UT district boundary. Swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
Yes.
Would you identify yourselves for the record as you testify, please?
Oh, Chris, I think there's one other additional thing.
Oh, did I leave something out?
Yeah, it ended up being printed on the
sorry.
top of the reverse side, too.
Ah, this page not left intentionally blank. No. Prior to hearing the case, the board has been requested to make a determination of whether or not the driveway cut through the buffer requires a variance. So I believe, Ms. Dolder, that's where you're going to want to start your discussion.
Yes, it is. So Maria Dolder, I'm an attorney. I represent Irving. So what we're asking the board to look at is Article 2842E of your zoning ordinance. What that ordinance states is that you have to have an average width of 15 feet of buffer along a front when you have a non-residential use and I want to make it clear, in a non-residential district, so it's permitted in that district, it fronts on a collector or a local street, and it happens to abut a residential zoning district, like in your edge of right-of-way or in the street. And so basically you have a residential district on one side of the street, a non-residential district on the other side of the street. This ordinance says that you have to have a buffer along your frontage. That's been interpreted to mean that you can't have a driveway in it. So therefore, there's a small portion of this property that's impacted by this particular ordinance. We're asking you to interpret it as it would apply to any property that would be situated in this, because as you know, this is an interpretation, not just for this particular property, but how it would be applied to all properties. If this is interpreted to mean that a party cannot have any access along their frontage if they are in this particular situation, it basically has the effect of saying that in the non-residential district, you can't have any non-residential uses because you have no access. You have to have a buffer. This would not be a reasonable interpretation of your zoning ordinance, and it's certainly contrary to the protection for the reasonable use of one's property. So if this is the result that's intended by your zoning ordinance, then really what the zoning ordinance has said is if you're in the situation, you're not allowed to have non-residential uses, even if they're permitted by right. Because the reality is if you can't have a driveway, you can't access the property, and therefore you can't have that use. There are situations, and once again, it doesn't apply to this one, but you do have to look outside of our particular property. There are situations where non-residential zones prohibit residential uses. In that particular case, if you can't have a residence on it, you have now taken away all use of that particular property under this zoning ordinance, which would be considered an unconstitutional taking. And so, like I said, even though that's not the case in this particular instance, if that is how this clause is interpreted, that's the effect that it could have on other properties that are similarly situated. I then also, it wasn't in my materials, but in looking at the ordinance a little bit further, then I move on to, there's also a section F, and it says buffer use restrictions. And it lists some restrictions that are expressly prohibited within the buffers. And I'll get to what those are in a second, but what I take that to mean is if you have express restrictions, that there must be something that's allowed in the buffer instead of just the buffer. And although I do see that in your restrictions it says buildings, impervious surfaces, and parking, we would like to throw out there, what if the driveway was porous or permeable? What if it's not an impervious surface? Does that change any interpretation of the zoning ordinance? Because clearly that should have been listed under your restrictions if that also would not be the case.
I want to make sure I understand this problem.
Sure.
The buffer is meant to, there's meant to be a, is it, how big a buffer?
It's supposed to average 15 feet along the entire frontage. So it doesn't have to be a full 15 feet for the frontage, but it has to average 15 feet.
And the buffer is supposed to be between the street and the rest of the property?
It's on your frontage.
Well, again, it's on the
buffer, that
frontage
adjacent
across
to.
from the residential district boundary. So in this case, it would be along what's now 2224 Pennacook Street, which is going to be merged with the rest of the property there.
I see. So the question is, can there be a driveway at all opposite those properties or opposite that zone?
Correct.
All right. So anywhere in this case on Pennacook Street?
Only if you're trying to do a non-residential use in the non-residential district. So we're in a non-residential district. I just want to make sure that's clear. The properties, all of the properties that Irving has that they're going to merge are non-residential.
But this does not affect the driveways from North State Street?
It does not, because North State Street is not in, it doesn't abut a residential district.
And if the driveway slid down to be in the CU commercial, urban commercial?
The city won't allow that. So as I'll get into this further, so what's going to happen and why this driveway is so essential is, quite frankly, without this driveway, we no longer have access to the site. So we have two things that are happening. With this redevelopment, the city wants us to close the two curb cuts that are too close to the intersection. So those, from an engineering perspective, they determine are relatively too close, and so they won't allow us to continue those two curb cuts. The second thing is that the city has a proposed project for the future. It's the Langley Park project. And although it's out quite a few years, it does impact this portion of Pennacook Street at the time that it's built. So what the city had planned for this area is they have planned a median strip to run the entire center of Pennacook Street, all the way up to, I think it's Bradley Street, maybe? Bradford Street. And so that median strip, once it is basically in place, will not allow us any access from the site off of Pennacook Street.
I see, so you won't be able to come off of Pennacook.
Yeah, so what we were able to do, however, was negotiate with the city engineers. They have agreed to allow us a cut in the median, but they only allowed the cut to be as far as possible from the intersection. So what ended up happening is, after those discussions with the city, Irving purchased those two abutting residential, they were residents, but they're obviously in the non-residential district. So they purchased those in order to get to a spot where the city said, we'd let you have that median split. And I think at the time, across the street, they were looking at the CVS project, and the CVS was also going to have a cut in the same general vicinity as to where they're allowing us. So they figured that that would be a good place to cut the median so that they would allow future development on the other side and give us access. But other than that, the city won't cut that median any closer to the intersection, and once that goes in, we lose all that access. And if you couple that with the fact that the city wants our North State Street to be right in, right out only, I mean, I'm not sure how we would even get tanker trucks to circulate the property anymore if we don't have that access on Pennacook Street. So that particular access is vital to this property, and it happens to fall under this particular zoning ordinance. And like I said, even though in our particular case, it may not be a complete, it's not our complete frontage, that portion of the frontage has a huge impact, and in interpreting it, you have to look to how it could impact another property, that it could be the entirety of their frontage that falls under this.
So if we could get back to then understanding the facts.
Yep.
The argument for why a variance should not be required given the language of the ordinance.
So I guess it's two things. A, it doesn't sound reasonable to me that you have a zoning ordinance in place that would, in essence, have the ability to take away somebody's total use of their property and not allow access to the property through a buffer. I understand the concept of why you want the buffer, but to require it to be the entire frontage and not allow any ability to have access, you basically take all of those uses away from the property owner. You couple that with the fact that your ordinance has a very specific section that says buffer use restrictions. You wouldn't need that if everything's restricted. So you have a section that deals with what is restricted within the buffer area, and it says buildings, impervious, and parking, as well as storage and display, goods and materials. That section would be rendered unnecessary if the intent of this ordinance were to prevent everything in the buffer, because you wouldn't need to list out specific restrictions for it. So I guess under that zoning ordinance, if you were to determine that, yes, even in the worst case scenario, you can't have anything, under E, under F, at the minimum, we should be able to allow to have the driveway if it's not impervious, because that is one of the restrictions. But it does not say that driveways are restricted if they're porous and allow for rainwater to go through it.
Are you proposing an impervious or a porous driveway?
If that were the way this board were to go, yes. That is a possibility. So we will do a porous driveway if this board were to determine that that is permitted under the zoning ordinance.
Craig, your thoughts?
Well, there's a couple issues here. And I'll just start with, the drive question there. And, even pervious pavement is considered driveway parking and would not be permitted within the buffer. Again, the purpose of the buffer is to provide screening and vegetation to protect the properties in the adjacent residential district. If there's a cut through that buffer, particularly with a driveway coming out, those people have lost that protection. But I think more importantly here is the arguments that Maria are giving, I think, go more to the discussion of hardship and variance. The discussion that, this perhaps could result in a taking of the land or taking away of use of the property or an unconstitutional taking is something for a court of law to interpret. The only thing that is before us is whether or not a variance is suitable. It's not for us to make a determination of whether or not the ordinance is overly restrictive or unconstitutional as it is applied to a piece of property. We can't make that determination. We don't have the skill, we don't have the authority to do that. So again, if the interpretation, if the reading of the ordinance says there needs to be a buffer there, it needs to be vegetative, there shouldn't be any impervious, et cetera, going through it, then that's as far as we can go. We can't make a determination that, well, it restricts them from reasonable use. I would also argue, though, in this case, with the exception of maybe some of the restrictions that have been discussed with the engineering office, it still doesn't apply to this piece of property because they're merging those lots all together, and access to this portion of the lot will be through the other portion of the lot. So even if that buffer is there and they're restricted from putting a driveway there, it still is not a taking or an interference of their ability to use the land in this case.
Because I don't own it yet?
No, because they will be merging the properties and the buffer will not restrict them from accessing this portion of the property from the other portion of the property.
I see.
From Pennacook Street.
Right. And, for that matter, though, too, maybe it would interfere if this lot was strictly, or the purple lots, the ones that 22, 24 were strictly proposed to be commercial. But residential uses are also permitted in this district. And it would not, interfere with all reasonable uses of the property. So.
Okay. Board members heard enough to discuss the question of whether or not a variance is required?
I think a variance is, I tend to agree with what Craig said. I think if the hypothetical came in front of us where it would amount to a taking, we at that point would be required to grant a variance to prevent a taking, but that's not what we have here. So I think that her points go to the decision on the variance, not whether a variance is needed. So I'd move to accept Craig's.
Is there a second?
Decision.
I'll second that.
Further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? All right, we will proceed with your thoughts on why variances are appropriate in all these cases, please.
So based on that decision, we need 4 variances for this proposal. They are outlined for you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk through the project as a whole and the justification as a whole instead of taking them individually. And clearly, if you have more questions or you need more information, just let me know. So this property is unique in several ways. First of all, the property located at 163 North State Street has already housed a retail motor fuel outlet and retail store. The applicant is simply proposing to redevelop and update the property. The use of that particular property will remain the same. The retail store will be placed entirely within the CU zone where it's permitted by right. The second portion that makes this parcel unique is that when we originally proposed this to the city, we went to the development team meeting. This planning department actually requested that the retail building be placed as close to the street for North State Street as possible. That was not the original plan that Irving had come in with. But apparently, the planning department has a vision to improve streetscaping and landscaping, pedestrian environment along North State Street. And they do that by placing their buildings closer to the edge of the sidewalk. And they actually require like some kind of pedestrian crossing so that they can get pedestrians from the street to the buildings. And so when we discussed with planning, they felt very strongly that that is the direction that this area of the city is going in, and they requested that we look at the site again and actually come in with a proposal that does that. So that is the proposal that we have before you. The unfortunate part is that once we locate that retail store to the front of the property as requested, a portion of the gasoline use has to be located within both districts. We're no longer able to keep the gasoline use in the CU district. So just for your knowledge, in the CU district, it's permitted by conditional use permit by the planning board. In the UT zone, we need a variance. So we have a small portion of that use that has to overlap into the UT zone based on the way that the planner indicated they'd like to see this developed.
How much is that portion?
There are two dispensers.
Two of the pumps?
Two of the
Yep.
pumps, okay. That's
Out
what-
of the
yeah, I
5.
see that.
So we have the 3 we were able to keep in the district where it's permitted by a conditional use permit. And that's solely just because we have to obviously allow the tanker trucks to get around. And based on where that building, there it is, based on where that building is, we can't cram all of the gas into that district anymore. And we did discuss that with the planner, and she still felt that just weighing it from a planning perspective, this was still a better proposal. So another issue that we are facing in this redevelopment is what I've already discussed with you when discussing the driveway. It's the future road project that's being proposed by the city. It's called the Langley Park Project, and I'm sorry to reiterate it, but just for the record on the variance. In that proposal, the city has planned a median strip that's going to run the entire length of Pennacook Street up to Bradley Street. And I just want to make sure it's clear. I know Craig mentioned that if we had that landscaped buffer along that street, we could still head off of North State Street. City engineering has made it quite clear that on North State Street, it's right in, right out only. Like, we're not allowed to keep the existing curb cuts that are there today. That's not something they're going to allow us to do. So the access on Pennacook Street is essential to this redevelopment. And I'll be quite frank that the redevelopment cannot occur if we don't have access on Pennacook Street. And the only place the city has basically agreed to allow us that access through the median strip is where we have it located. Irving specifically went out and bought those 2 properties based on its discussion with the city's engineering in planning for this project in order to gain that access. So that's the driveway, that location that was agreed upon with the city when going into this. It certainly makes the most sense. The city was also looking at the fact that at the time there was a proposal across the street to make a commercial use of that property as well. It was the CVS project, and they were also looking for access. So I think they were looking at future intent of what might happen across the street. I know it's residential, but that was at least on the table. And so, although the applicant does intend to merge these 3 lots as part of the proposal, the unfortunate part is that once they do that, this lot is transected by a district line. Now, I want to make sure it's still clear that both districts are considered non-residential. By nature, we're not asking you to change a residential district. We are in a non-residential district. So it's also important to note that in doing this, we are actually reducing the number of driveways on these properties. There are currently 6 with the combined lots. We will be reducing them to 2 on the site. We had 4 curb cuts along Pennacook Street. 2 were commercial, 2 were residential. That's being reduced to 1 driveway, the driveway that's proposed. And clearly, as I indicated, the North State Street will then become right in, right out only because the city doesn't want to have lefts into that. So now we have the lot coverage requirements. So having this split zone then creates an issue with lot coverage. So if these lots had been merged prior to 2001, we'd be all set because the zoning ordinance has a clause for that. Since they have not, then we're required to calculate lot coverage as it relates to each particular zone. So on the CU zone part, we meet that. 80% is permitted, and we'll only have 75.3%.
Sorry, you mean each area must
Yes.
meet for that zone, or the
Yes.
total
No.
is aggregate? Okay.
No, because we didn't already have, so if we had merged these lots previous to 2001, then we could have done the total aggregate.
I see.
The problem is because we didn't, the city actually makes us calculate per
So
zone.
every single zone has to, every area
Yes.
is, okay.
So what happens here is we have 2 different zones. So we have the CU zone, which is along North State Street, and then the UT zone, which is up above. So in the CU zone, it allows 80% lot coverage, and we are at 75.3. So in that zone, we're fine. In the abutting UT zone, instead of the 80%, they only allow 75%, and we're at 80%. So we exceed the UT by 5%. So the interesting part is once we do merge all of the lots, 77.1%, so still higher than the UT, but lower than the CU. So as a combined total, if we were looking at that and if we were able to go by the CU zone, we would meet it. In terms of parking and layout, so the current parking layout on the property already includes parking in front of the building. As such, that type of layout is very typical for this type of use, especially given the location of the building. It's not actually possible to put the parking behind or to the side of the property, just given its location. The more difficult part with this particular property is this property has two frontages. So when we're looking at where your parking is located in adjacent to streets, we have two frontages that we have to deal with, which makes this property unique and contributes to the difficulties of redeveloping it. Along with that fact, one happens to be a collector street and the other is an arterial street, and both of those have differing requirements under them as well. So with all of the frontage, that restricts where we're able to put parking. The sort of location of the building dictates where that parking is going to have to be, so there is no choice but to have parking between the building and the street. And so we need a variance for that. We don't believe that the proposed use will alter the essential characteristics of the neighborhood or the property. It's important to remember that these lots are zoned non-residential. So we understand that there are residential uses in the area and that there are residential uses across the street, but this property is not surrounded primarily by residential uses. Instead, it abuts mixed uses, which was the intent of these zones. We abut the City of Concord Fire Department, a bank, a Rite Aid store, and then you do have the residential uses on Pennacook Street. But those are not the primary abutters. It's not like this is a property that's surrounded by residential uses, and this would be the first commercial use in the area. In terms of residential uses, it's important to note that the applicant is not only able to maintain all of its setbacks on the property, but it will maintain a 10-foot residential buffer on the boundary line abutting the adjacent residential use. It's a two-family. That's on Pennacook Street. So we will maintain that buffer, and we're also going to put up an 8-foot high white vinyl fence along that boundary to keep that separation.
Where is the vinyl fence going to go?
So Frank's going to point.
Would go in the west end of the lot?
Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Okay.
In addition to that, except for the portion where we're asking to allow for the driveway, we are able to maintain the average 15-foot buffer on the portion of frontage of Pennacook Street where that buffer is required. So as a result, there will be no adverse impact on the neighboring adjoining neyborhood. On the other hand, without allowing for these variances, the applicant is not able to reasonably redevelop the property. They'll be denied access to the property if we're not able to put that driveway in, and therefore granting the variance will result in substantial justice. As I know you all know, one of the guiding rules in evaluating substantial justice is that any loss to the individual that's not outweighed by a gain to the general public is considered an injustice. And just a few other things. I mean, we certainly understand that there are residential uses around us, but I just want to point out that one of the residential properties, the one that's directly across from this, they already directly abut the bank. So this is not something new that's creeping into their neighborhood. The bank directly abuts their property and has existed there. Some of the neighboring properties, as I indicated, had previously attempted to be part of the CVS development, which was going to be a commercial use for this area, which made sense. Both the CU and the UT districts state that they're intended under your zoning ordinance for the establishment of mixed residential and commercial uses. And so it is the intent of your zoning ordinance to allow mixed uses in these zones. And like I said, I can't say it enough that this is a non-residential zone. As a result, this proposal will not unduly and in a marked degree conflict with the ordinance such that it violates your ordinance's basic zoning objectives and therefore it will not be contrary to the public interest. Also, there's nothing about this that in granting it will have an impact on public safety, health, or the general welfare of the public. When we look at the limitations of this particular property, the fact that in order to have access to Pennacook Street in the future, when the city's attempts to do its roadway project, requires additional land because we no longer can redevelop the site on the property that Irving owns. And in doing that and trying to accommodate that, we now have a property that has a split zone. That makes this property unique, and it makes it so that, quite frankly, without the variance relief, the applicant cannot reasonably redevelop the property that they have been using for this very use. The applicant has made a very concerted effort to try to minimize the variance relief that's required. Quite frankly, some of the relief that we need is because the city has requested that we go in a certain direction, and we're trying to work with the city in an effort to not only redevelop this, but redevelop it in a manner that the city would like to see and is going towards in the future, and that has driven some of the variance relief that we need in this particular one. We've also tried to work with the engineering on the North State Street driveways. Like I said, they want them right in, right out, so we're working on that. That creates the situation where we do need the driveway on Pennacook Street. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions, and we obviously ask that you grant the variances that we have requested.
Questions from the board?
Just a quick one, are you saying that is the only reason you bought those other 2 lots and merged because of the planning requirements?
Yes. It's for the access, not the planning requirements. We bought those for the access because when they first went down the path of looking at this proposal, I think it came up to Frank that there was this future roadway, and it came to their attention that if they redeveloped the site as is, they'd lose access on Pennacook Street at some point in time.
Okay, so not the city's current planning requirements, but your
No, it was
projection of what is
what the
ultimately
city is going to do with that road.
Okay.
Other questions from the board?
I might have missed it. So the original station that was there was shut down with the purpose of redeveloping it, or I think you might have said something differently.
Yeah, no, you can,
Just out of curiosity, I guess probably.
Sure. No, yeah, so
Wait,
for
we
the
have your name,
record,
please.
Jennifer Daigle with Irving Oil. So we did shut the site down because there was an issue of tank compliance, and so the tanks had run out, and rather than just replace them, we thought, well, let's look at redeveloping the site in a better way. So that's why it was shut down.
Yeah, can I add to that, Mr. Chairman? Frank Montier with MHF Design. The gas portion of the site was closed down first because of the tank compliance issue. We wanted to replace the tanks. The challenge there was the current fuel tanker circulation and the tanks in the corner. If we did replace them in that location and the Langley Parkway project went forward, we couldn't get the truck in to service those tanks in the future. So Irving did not want to spend the money to do that tank replacement and move it later. So that's when we started looking at other options for access. Irving chose to close down the gas portion first, lost that business in the meantime while we were trying to come up with a plan, and then ultimately they closed the convenience store just because the business wasn't there for that either. So that's why it's been closed, I think, since the end of 15. So instead of rushing to get some tanks in and stay open, they worked on acquiring more property to look at more long-term solution, and that's why we worked with the city traffic engineer, went to a couple planning board hearings, came up with a couple different options that could work for all parties, and that's why we're here now.
Other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who would like to be heard in favor of this appeal? Is there anyone who'd like to be heard in opposition to it? Please come forward.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Gail Snow.
I'm Russell Snow.
You all promise to tell the truth?
Rita Peretra.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your time. I realize it's getting late, and
I know that you're putting a lot of time into this evening. We are adamantly opposed to this request. We live in the house directly across the street, the one that was referred to, we own 27 Pennacook Street, excuse me. We live there. Where the bank used to be. And other than that small Irving store that's now closed, it's all houses. Our house is a fairly large colonial, a very nice house. And my mother's house is a well-maintained Cape, you know, a nice home. She's lived there. They built that house 60 years ago. My grandparents built our house. So it's been in the family consistently. The houses that Irving has acquired, those were houses. Those were our neighbors. There was a single-family house directly next to the Irving store, which they purchased, a ranch-style home owned by an older couple, and next door to that was a family. They purchased 2 single-family homes to expand a large commercial development. This is a neighborhood, and I think one of the things we've always valued about living in Concord is it's a city of neighborhoods, and it's really beyond my understanding to fathom how the city would be meeting with a large commercial enterprise to plan a project such as this without any public input to this point. And I can't imagine that it feels appropriate to the members of this board to have a gas station with 5 pumps. Do we really need 5 pumps on Pennacook Street? It's already a very congested street during the morning and evenings. You've got the insurance company up the street. We have the Boys Club. We have the Knights of Columbus. Bishop Brady High School. These are community organizations that use that street. It's very, very heavily traveled, and there are a lot of pedestrians. As I said, we have the Boys Club right up the street. So to expand this retail store and gas station up into the neighborhood, we're just very opposed to that. It will totally destroy our property values. I don't think I would want to live across the street from 5 gas pumps. I don't think most people would. When we bought that house from my grandparents in 1985, it was a very small store. The bank was never a problem. We have a big brick wall. It never interfered with the street. And people have referenced the CVS proposed development. That was shot down by the city. That did not happen because the neighborhood came out in opposition. We personally didn't oppose that because it was on North State Street. We did not see that encroaching up Pennacook Street. It was already a bank. We knew that going into it, and we didn't have a problem with that. So I would let my mother or my husband, if they want to add something I haven't covered.
Well, it's the same thing. I've lived in my house 60 years, and I've brought up my family, and now my grandchildren come and my great-grandchildren, and it's a busy street. It's hard to get out of the driveway as it is, and with the gas pump there, it's going to be something.
Well, we wouldn't be able to live there. I mean, we would not be able to live there with a large, I mean, we've been on the turnpike and seen the type of gas stations. I mean, nobody wants to live across the street from that. I don't think the area needs 5 gas pumps. We have a number of service stations within our area. It's certainly not a need.
The need for the business is not a zoning issue.
Okay.
Is there anything else that you'd like us to know?
Well, what I'd like to add is, when we didn't go into this blind, not knowing what we were buying when we bought our house. When we bought our house, the bowling alley was only half the size. The fire department wasn't there. There was a small building across the street for the water department. The bank that's next door to us originally was a small grocery store. The current Irving station was just a one-bay repair shop. Where the Rite Aid is was half the size that it is now, and it was a small Pontiac garage. Maybe some of you remember this stuff. The Boys Club was not there. The insurance company was half the size. Bishop Brady was half the size. So everything has just kept getting bigger and bigger and closing in on us. You can look at the drawings and see the dimensions. We were estimating earlier on ourselves that, gee, when the traffic is backed up coming out of these places when they're opening or closing, that the traffic backs up 100 or 200 feet. This station is 250 feet long across the street. Okay, so they want to say they want to close 4 of the entranceways and only have 2. The one that they want to open is not going to be a house with a car pulling out of a driveway. It's going to be hundreds of cars, who knows how many hours a day. And the only way now they're going to be able to get into this property for the gas tank to fill is to practically drive through our front yard. If there's going to be a buffer in there at some point, we won't even be able to get in and out of our own driveways. So
I think we have the gist of what you want to say.
I appreciate that.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard?
We
Please.
also submitted a letter.
Yes, I see the letter. I'm not going to read that into the record
No,
because
you don't have to.
it's substantially duplicated by what you just said. Swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
John Radley. I live in the surrounding area, and I just actually happen to be here tonight for no reason, but my concern is I heard the lady, the attorney say, right in, right out. So basically, they're going to divert all the traffic off of Main Street, up Pennacook Street, and where's it going to flow to? That'd be my concern, would be a traffic study maybe, to find out where that traffic's going to go. Because if it comes up Pennacook Street, there's only a couple of places it can go. Go down Bradley Street, I believe, or go down Rumford Street to get back to the main street. There's no way to flow back. There's no pattern of flow of traffic. I don't know if that's been addressed or not been addressed.
Did you have a question?
I believe you're going to be able to take a left to go down Penn.
But she said,
Yeah, it's right in, right out off of North State Street, then I
Off the
believe you
state,
can
but
turn both ways.
You're going to be able to turn left down.
So I won't be turning off right off Straight Street, I mean Pennacook Street? Okay.
I'll let Maria clarify that.
That
Right.
misinterpret that. Okay.
All right. Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard? Any comments from code enforcement?
I don't have anything special to add. If you have any questions, I'd be happy
All right.
to try to address them.
Ms. Dolder, would you like to offer a factual clarification in response to anything you've heard?
So yes, just to clarify that last question, the right in, right out is on North State Street. So the whole intent of the driveway on Pennacook Street and working to get that median break is so that left turns can be taken onto Pennacook Street. So that'll allow some of that flow. As part of planning board process, because this would obviously have to go through the planning board, we will do a traffic study. That'll be part of the requirement of the planning board, so they will be looking at traffic, and those are all planning board issues that we will need to address at that point in time. So the only thing that I'd like to say, and I'm not insensitive to the fact that there are residential uses across the street, but by their own testimony, they indicated that this street is already a busy street, that it is not just residential uses. They have a Boys and Girls Club, they have an insurance company, they have Bishop Brady, they have a church. This is already an area that has been developed with non-residential uses, mostly because a lot of it is zoned non-residential. It's kind of a weird zoning that is out in that area. I know they indicated they didn't have a problem with the CVS, but that was a direct abutter to their property. So that particular development would have been a direct abutter to them. And like I said, this is already a busy street, and I just wanted to reiterate that we are in a non-residential district.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
With that, we'll declare the public testimony portion of the hearing closed. We have heard testimony that the Irving Oil Company would like to redevelop an existing gas station by adding a couple of lots immediately to the west, that they were induced to this in part by the city's request that they not have an entrance within a certain distance of the intersection of Pennacook and North State Streets. And they have also testified that they would not be allowed to enter the site from Pennacook Street if they were not granted a variance through the buffer. Discussion.
I can definitely understand why the neighbors don't want it to be developed. It's just gonna be more congestion and more invasion into their residential use. But I don't think they're not asking for a variance to expand the gas station in principle. They just need, the variance they're asking for are relatively modest to accomplish what seems to be a pretty well thought out plan. The expansion itself is essentially allowed as a matter of right, if I understand it.
Except for the two tanks, or
In
the
the
two
UTs,
dispensers in the UT district.
UT zone, yep.
Which, I mean, in its current use, if they want to redevelop it at all, they're not going to turn it into, without a great burden, it's not, they're going to turn it into something completely unrelated. It's probably going to stay as a gas station, and this seems like a reasonable way to redevelop it. So I don't think those two tankers there really, I think that's a reasonable use of the new lot, considering all the surrounding areas.
Other thoughts? Anyone? Everyone?
I'll make a motion to approve. I think Irvin's done a good job here, and it's a reasonable use of the property.
All right. The lot's unique, the corner lot?
It is very unique. It's got the two properties on Pennacook and North State Street, so you have I believe it's very unique, and being a corner lot.
Not being able to access through the buffer would be an unreasonable
Correct.
restraint on the use of the property. It's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion?
I'll second. No, I'll second it, but I also want to add the comment that had Irving stayed open in its current configuration, eventually they would have been denied access from Pennacook Street with the building of a median strip. And I think that's sort of a hardship created by the city.
For the Langley coming down.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to add that, but I'll second the motion.
It's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The vote is unanimous. The variance is granted. Variances are granted. Next case this evening is case 1218, Concord Litho Group. The applicant wishes to reconstruct the parking areas for a printing and warehouse facility and requests a variance to Article 2877F driveway widths to allow a driveway opening of 109 feet where a maximum driveway width of 28 feet is allowed for property located at 92 Old Turnpike Road in an IN industrial district.
It's all right. Thank you.
I think we should try to get to the end of this.
Oh, thank you.
It looks like we're going to wind up going past our curfew, but what's our curfew? Well, we don't start new cases after 9:30.
I'm good. I'm still alive.
Everybody good to keep going?
Yeah, sure. Let's press forward.
Make
Can
these
we
people
press
come
on?
back later.
We've already sat here.
Yeah, the poor people.
Okay.
Yeah, sit here. No, I'm ready.
I'm not responsible for anything I say after 9.
What, should I go that way?
I'm
just gonna, no, you stay.
Might be for this,
What's that now? Sure. I'm sorry.
the school conversion in Pennacook
Oh, yeah.
to a condo. Yeah, that's not what we are now. We're at 1218.
Craig, we have
let's see what
packets of
happens.
pictures.
Sure, you can just hand them out to the board.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci. So I'll give it back to you and you'll.
One should be sufficient.
Feel like a Boy Scout here. How? Swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Thank you very much. If you would identify yourselves for the record as you testify, please.
Peter Cook from Concord Lithgow.
Erin Lambert with Novus Engineering.
And Connie Lane with Warren Reno.
Please proceed.
Sure, be brief. Just, give a quick history and overview of the building and talk a little bit about what we're trying to do here. So it might be easier if I stand up and point. This is the site. I'm sure you're probably familiar with the site. We've been here since 1958, since we started in the front of the building, and we've added on over the years, as you can see. 1960, 1969, 74, 78, and then in the rear of the building in 1984. We have a commercial printing and it's a commercial printing direct mail facility. It's 214,000 square feet. We currently use only about 175,000 square feet, so we've been reducing our footprint over the years. I also want to just make sure that I orient you here. This is Old Turnpike Road, and this is Carroll Park Drive. So you can see that company C. We've been reducing from the rear of the building. This is space that we built back in the 80s. And now that we've reduced our space enough, we're looking at ways to make that rear space more appealing, more marketable to a wider amount of uses. That will require adding some parking. As you can see, there's not a lot here, as well as some loading docks in the rear of the building. I call it the rear of the building, but the side away from Terrell Park Drive. So we'll be adding. Aaron's going to talk more about the site plan itself, but we'll be adding a road to the back here. There's the land parcel actually goes here, so there's land for additional parking as well as for truck access and truck maneuverability on site. She'll show that to you in the plan as well. So that's part of that plan. The other part is redeveloping the parking lot here that's in the front. As you can see, it pretty much flows into Terrell Park Drive. There's a little bit of, obviously it's not compliant the way it is. There's a little bit of history there, which I'll show you. This is dug this out of the archives. This is an aerial that was taken, I think, in around 1969 when we built this other part of the building. We hadn't built the whole rear of the building, but this was our parking lot, and Terrell Park Drive didn't exist at that time. It wasn't built until 1974. So we used that, what became Terrell Park Drive, essentially as our parking lot. When Terrell Park Drive went in, our parking lot abutted that, and it hadn't changed in years. That's the history of the space, of the building. Good view there. Aaron's going to talk about the plan itself in terms of the variance.
Did the city take land from you when they built that street?
I don't know if the city took
There's
land.
a copy of an agreement in the original packet there.
I don't think they took it. I think it was a paper street as part of the development out there, but nobody was out there, and it just had been used this way, and so they brought the trucks in, used it as maneuvering, and then in '74, when they did that, which is part of the history about what Aaron's going to explain to you about how they have to back in off of Terrell Park, and there's no maneuverability on the site.
I'm going to start with a little preview of where we're trying to go and why we're here. So ultimately, Concord Litho would like to build some additional loading docks, and so we need to bring the site into compliance in order for us to submit a major site plan through the planning department. So what we're here before you tonight for is a variance for a 109-foot wide driveway. It's directly across from these 6 existing loading docks that, as Peter mentioned, were built in 1969, prior to Terrell Park Drive being in existence. It was their driveway. So this is what you see today on the site. The city's been looking at the site for a number of years because a lot of the parking just sort of bleeds into Terrell Park Drive. There's no differentiation. So right now the curb cut, if you want to call it that, is 458 feet wide. They have striped it for parking, so they're only parking on their property. But it's a continuous sea of pavement from the building all the way to Terrell Park Drive. There's then another little curb cut here, but that's 35 feet. That also exceeds what's allowed by your ordinance today. And then there's some loading docks here. So what they would like to do in order to bring the site into compliance is to create a formal curb line with granite curb along Terrell Park Drive and define curb cuts that would comply with the city ordinance. The only one that wouldn't is the 109-foot driveway that we're talking about here. So this plan would really be a betterment to the city. This driveway would comply, this driveway would comply, and they would all have adequate driveway separation. There's an existing curb cut here to 2 loading docks. One of the things we want to do in bringing the major site plan before the city is to close those 2 loading docks and move those loading operations to the rear of the site, in addition to providing additional loading docks. When we redesign the site, there's an awful lot of parking here today. So you'll notice that there's less intense parking along Terrell Park Drive. There'll be more parking in the rear of the site. The other benefit of the plan would be that we would be taking some impervious area, converting it to green space, and putting in landscape islands and putting in stormwater controls. So the reason why we can't narrow this more is just to allow the trucks to continue to use those docks. We basically need to look at if any of those docks were in existence, could another truck back up to the dock next door to it? So we've narrowed this as much as we can. We've significantly reduced the 458 feet down to 109, and that's really the minimum distance that we can provide in order to still fully utilize all 6 of those loading docks.
Is that the width of all 6?
Yeah.
Essentially.
Essentially.
Oh,
Yeah, we looked at ways, if we necked it down, so that they could maybe narrow it in the middle to still access the side. But realistically, if a truck were parked in any of those other docks, you couldn't fully access all of them, and so it would be restricting the use.
So I'll do the legal part of the, and I don't want to, given the hour, whatever, I'll just refer you to our application.
We have read it.
Okay, so the hardship, just to reiterate what Mr. Cook and Aaron indicated, was that the loading docks were approved and built in 1968-69 before the dedication of Terrell Park as a city street in 73. None of the other buildings on Terrell Park Drive were built prior to 1973, and none have multiple loading docks facing Terrell Park Drive that necessitate backing into the driveway. During each of the 5 additions to the building, the city never required accommodating truck turning movements on site to access the loading docks. And the loading docks are critical to the operation of the property as a printing business and warehouse, which has been at this location essentially since 1968. The 25-foot, the 28-foot driveway would hinder the reasonable use of their building and continued operation as a publishing business and warehouse. It also, and I think, I don't think it was mentioned, there's congestion. It's very close to the intersection of Terrell Park and Old Turnpike, right near the dump. And it would create congestion if you've got trucks waiting to get into these loading docks on Terrell Park Drive. So the idea to allow them to move quickly into, even though they're backing in, they can move relatively quickly in rather than have to, with a 28-foot wide driveway, you would have to, they'd congregate there on Terrell Park Drive. Is that correct, Peter? That's true. And so this, and the idea also is that this would also allow for more pedestrian safety. Right now, there's no sidewalk, there's no curb cuts, there's nothing there. And so the idea would be to have with the curb cuts that, and even though it's 109 foot, there's nothing there now. It's 458 feet long, so it would improve the safety. As far as the second standard, that there's no fair and substantial relationship exists between the general purposes of the zoning ordinance and the specific restrictions of the property. Really, when you could take the special conditions of the property into account, granting the variance actually improves the conditions that are there, improves the public safety, makes the congestion on Terrell Park less, and makes more safe for pedestrians. I think that
in the application, it's pretty straightforward as to how it meets the other criterion for a variance. And I'm happy to ask any questions that you might have.
Questions from the board? Good.
I'm not super familiar with the area, so if you removed all those parking spots, that's essentially one big driveway as it exists right now?
Basically, they're striped, and so what they've done is they've put cones out. There's actually striped spaces in this 109-foot area now, but, so they put cones out to prevent
Stop people
from parking there, because as it was designed and approved, it doesn't, even the company realizes it's not working, so they put cones out and keep them from parking there.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is there anyone who'd like to be heard in favor of this appeal? Is there anyone in opposition to it? Comments from code enforcement?
Nothing more to add.
With that, we'll declare the public testimony portion of the hearing closed. We heard a request to grant a variance for an oversized driveway. We also heard testimony that the net result will be a considerably improved arrangement along the street from what there is now, where there's no driveways at all, or it's all driveway, depending on how you look at life. And also a request to allow the property owner to develop parking so that he can make different use of an existing building along Terrell Park Drive. We also heard testimony that when the building was built, Terrell Park Drive did not exist. Discussion?
Move approval.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The vote is unanimous. The variance is granted. Welcome. Our next case this evening is case 1618, Brian Matat. The applicant requests a special exception from the table of uses accessory to a principal residential use in accordance with Article 28-534, outdoor storage of recreational equipment, to permit the outdoor storage of a recreational trailer for property at 17 Lake Street in an RN residential neighborhood district. Gentlemen. Thank you. Swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Would you give us your names as you testify, please?
Brian Matat.
And could you tell us a little bit about what you want to do and why you feel a special exception is justified?
Currently, the trailer is located behind the main structure as per required by city ordinance. With the location as it is, approximately only 10% of the trailer is even visible to general public, given the fact that it's behind the structure. The trailer is not connected to any services, so it does not create any undue hardship towards the city. This is considered only a temporary arrangement and should be alleviated before the end of this year.
Why is that? Why do you need to do this temporarily?
Basically, I took in a couple of friends to help them out, and that's where they were living, was in their trailer. And in process of doing this, they're living in a converted room in our basement, and that's only one room availability, so they're still using the trailer for their belongings. So the situation is considered temporary, and once their situation is resolved, the trailer will be going back with them.
Do you have a time frame of that being the expectation?
I believe that will be within 180 days.
You're hedging a little bit. Is it? Are you sure about that, or?
I can't guarantee that. That's why I say by the end of this year. But I would believe it would be within the next 180 days, because we would like to not have the trailer there this coming winter. It was hard enough with it, getting it situated during the winter this time.
Travel trailers, is it like an RV?
No, this is actual tow behind trailer.
But it's something you can live in. It's a
camper.
A camper, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It's a camper, but just personal belongings in it right now. No one's currently living in it.
Questions from the board? Thank you very much. Is there anyone who wishes to be heard in favor of this appeal? Is there anyone who wishes to be heard in opposition to it? Please come forward.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening. You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do, sir.
May we have your name, please?
Certainly. My name is Sandra Patel. It's a little late, so I'm going to read my notes, if I may.
You bet.
My name is Sandra Patel, and I'm here tonight as a homeowner on Lake Street, and also due to the growing concern in West Concord, in particular on Lake Street. The item in question tonight is a travel trailer at 17 Lake Street, which arrived this winter. The major concern is the travel trailer. It does appear to be in very poor condition physically, and seems to be used on a regular basis by occupants. The reason that we request, we being my husband and I, that the Zoning Board of Adjustment deny Mr. Matot's request to permit outdoor storage of this travel trailer is that a second non-approved driveway has been plowed this winter to have two vehicles access the trailer on the right-hand side of the home. One or both of these vehicles have been parked next to the travel trailer on a regular basis, which brings up another concern. I feel that this travel trailer is not owned by Mr. Matot, and I did just hear the testimony that it is someone else's, but I was not aware of that prior to. And we feel that this person or people are living in the trailer. Another concern is the trailer can only be accessed by this new temporary driveway that was put in on the property, which I will refer to as an access driveway. It was plowed by a snowplow truck, a residential type truck, over what would be a yard. And in the last 2 or so weeks, no vehicles have been using this area. Do you want me to show you on there, or you can get it?
In my order backwards here.
Okay, there, oops. Nope. I think you have the right house there. Oh.
Other way?
Other way.
This other way.
There.
Boy, am I confused.
Okay, there's one of the buildings. All right. So, you gotta go.
Go 180, the other side of the street.
Yeah, other. Wish I was better at directions here.
I'll stick
That's
to the, I'm gonna stick to
27
the
Lake
aerials.
Street. Keep going down. All right, anyways.
Now, having enjoyed that tour of the neighborhood,
Did you enjoy it? Did you
Yeah.
catch all the?
could you point out on this plan what you're talking about here?
Sure. If you tell me where 17 is, I can go from there.
It's right here.
Okay, that's 17. So this is the usual driveway that was authorized with the home when it was built. So the travel trailer is up here in the back. This is all hilly and wooded. So a plow truck plowed up this area. This is very muddy, hilly, and what has happened is we know for a fact that this is very muddy because when Mr. Matot put in a above-ground pool about 1.5 years ago, one side collapsed and the mud ran through the yard. The city of Concord had to come and remove with equipment the mud that was in the roadway here on Lake Street. So this trailer was pushed up into this area. It now sits on cement blocks, which in my opinion makes it more viable for someone to have a stable trailer to sleep in or be in, as opposed to just pushing it up and leaving it for someone else to live in your basement. What else do I have? I guess our big point is it does appear to be more of a permanent structure than a temporary structure. There are other neighbors here, I'm sure, that may address other issues, but if not, let me tell you one more. There are dogs tied to this. There have been a dog tied at each end of the trailer through the winter time. I would just like to say in closing, my overview is that when this house was built a few years ago, there was a variance that was asked for because it only has 66 feet of frontage, evidently. There was no objection, assuming that the house and the yard would be maintained properly by the new owners. But Mr. Matot has not been a good steward for the neighborhood, and by giving you a visual reference to this yard right now, as of today, there is a very large collapsed metal shed to the right of this trailer, which is actually on the north side boundary. On the south side boundary, there is a large unfinished wooden shed with a push mower or some type of equipment hanging out of it. South of that, there are 2 riding mowers that have sat there all winter.
Yeah, but I think this is getting a little beyond.
And I'm done. But that was the visual. We have 4 vehicles, a motorcycle, a trailer, and thank you for your consideration. It just has not felt that it is part of the neighborhood.
Ms. Patel, where do you live? On Lake Street?
My husband and I live at 53 Lake Street, which is the last house. We own 27 Lake Street. We own 43 Lake Street. We own 38 Lake Street, and we have a house at 6 Quaker. We have 5 properties that I feel are very influenced by the effect that this property is doing to the entire neighborhood.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard? Please come forward. Keep in mind that repeating what you've already heard said is not helpful, but if you've got something new to add, we'd love to hear it.
I hear some echoes.
Swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
Yes, sir.
May we have your name, please?
My name's Adam Dodge. I'm the homeowner of 7 Lake Street.
Mm-hmm.
Over the past, say, year or so, just to kind of give you a general overview of the property, there have been many, many things that have appeared on the property that are in dilapidated condition. The shed that was already mentioned, there's a second wood shed that's there. You look at the property and you're ashamed to live on the street. That's what it boils down to. This winter, early this winter, there was a trailer that was pulled up into the property. I know there's a statement made that said it's not very visible. It's extremely visible. I see it every day on my drive to work. I don't appreciate it. Everybody on our street are pretty responsible citizens. We keep our yards and our neighborhood pretty well kept and clean. This is the exception in our neighborhood, and I'd like for it to go away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there someone else who wants to be heard? Please come forward. You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do.
May we have your name, please?
Kathleen Cleary?
What would you like us to know?
Sure. So, first of all, I'm a realtor, and I'm trying to sell the neighbor's house at 21 Lake Street, which is next door to this property that we're discussing. So, 2 things. So, first of all, one of the owners and one of the sons couldn't be here tonight. He's in Buffalo with his son. So, I have a letter from him, and it's similar information, so I'm not going to read it.
Okay.
Okay. I did take a couple of pictures, but it looks like you've got it all up there, but I'm going to also just give you the pictures that I took. And as a realtor and somebody who's trying to sell this house for the mother who can no longer live at that house, it's a real eyesore, and buyers and other agents have said something to me about it. As a matter of fact, this morning, an agent in my office who actually had 2 showings there I asked her, what some of the issues were, and she said, well, first of all, that trailer just looks awful, and it's obvious. And when this agent and the buyer were at the house, there was also police presence at the Matat's house. I think it was for the dogs, I'm not sure.
But yeah, that's beyond.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, okay. So anyway, the eyesore, so it's really hurting us trying to sell the house. So, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, I'm sorry. You want those?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have one more person who'd like to be heard.
Yes.
Please come forward.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Jason Dennis. I do, in fact, swear to tell the truth.
That's good
I live
news.
next door at 15 Lake Street, so that's the house to the south. And I'm going to address very briefly some of the legal criteria here because from what I've heard, this does not belong to the resident owner or occupant because I don't think we have a tenant in this situation. So I guess I'll leave that up to you, how you define occupant under your zoning ordinance. But I would say they miss that requirement. Additionally, no such, under your ordinance, no such recreational equipment shall be used for living, sleeping, or housekeeping. They're not sleeping there, but they're obviously using it for living and housekeeping purposes because they're keeping all their belongings in there. So they simply don't meet the basis for which to get this special exception in the first place. I will echo everything that you've heard with regards to just the nature of the view. I do have some pictures out of my own bedroom window, which I now don't open the blinds anymore because I don't like to look out there. With regard to whether it sticks with the spirit of the ordinance, you probably all know your own ordinance, but I'm going to, just for my brief purposes here, refer to 2815, which deals with convenience, comfort, aesthetics, prosperity, quality of life. None of those are in any way going to be promoted by the variance sought in this situation. Other such hazards and dangers and controlled nuisance producing uses. You've heard about the driveway that's created runoff. I imagine that actually, based on it being a slope now as opposed to a yard, which has grass, which absorbs water, increases stormwater runoff, which we don't like to do. To conserve natural beauty, this is F, and open space. Obviously, it does not do that. To conserve property values, I think we've basically heard an expert opinion because we heard from a real estate agent that says it does not do that, certainly. And then 2815G, elimination of those uses which adversely affect the character, development, and value of property. I think you would to a person on Lake Street, and some people unfortunately actually left just because we were running late in this and they just weren't here, but there would be other people wishing to speak, so maybe you're glad they left. To make this shorter, that would indicate that they do not feel that their quality of life, nuisance in the value of their property in any way would be promoted. In fact, obviously it's been negatively impacted and diminished by what we see here. I would just provide, just for whatever the board's use may want to be of it, a picture out my bedroom window, and I actually brought three in case the board will require the applicant to be able to respond to one. And I'll just pass it this way. Actually, I'll give you guys two. I don't need it anymore. Sure. And I have one I'll leave up here for any rebuttal so that can be referred to. And the second picture I have actually shows the second driveway that was talked about with the truck in it. There's a red truck that's in the newly created driveway, and there's a champagne/bronzy colored truck in the original driveway. I believe the trailer has California plates for whatever that's worth. And so I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You bet. Does anyone else like to be heard? Comments from code enforcement?
Nothing to add.
All right.
Joe Labonte has worked on this as an enforcement action. This is the culmination of that activity. The owner has the opportunity to request zoning relief to be able to keep it there, so that's where we're at.
Mr. Matat, would you like to offer any factual clarification in response to anything you've heard? Very good. With that, we'll declare the public testimony portion of the hearing closed. We have a request for a special exception to park a travel trailer behind an existing house. We heard testimony that the travel trailer is actually supported on concrete blocks and that it has been used from time to time for residents, although is not being used that way now. And we've also heard testimony from the neighbors that it has been used as a residence, and the snowplow was, or the driveway was snowplowed in order to gain access to it in the winter. Discussion?
Well, I mean, to grant the special exception, we have to make a number of findings. I don't think we have to go through all of them because we have to make all of those findings. I don't think it's consistent with the spirit and the intent of the ordinance, the way it's parked. I mean, there's been overwhelming testimony from the neighbors, and I don't think it's appropriate for the proposed location, the way it's being used. And I think it's out of character with the neighborhood, and that's been the overwhelming testimony from the neighbors, so I move to deny the special exception.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The vote is unanimous. The special exception is denied. Next case this evening is case 1818, Nawaz Azam for Steel Brick LLC. The applicant wishes to convert an existing non-residential building, former Summer Street School, into 8 residential dwellings and requests the following. Variance to the table of principal uses to permit the conversion of a non-residential building to accommodate 1 or more dwelling units where such conversions are not permitted. Variance to Article 2845, development of multifamily dwellings. Minimum tract requirements to permit development of multifamily dwellings on a 24,393 square foot tract of land when a minimum tract size requirement is 25,000 square feet. Variance to Article 2845, development of multifamily dwellings, maximum lot coverage and density to permit a total lot coverage of 66.2% where total lot coverage of 50% is permitted. Variance to Article 2845, development of multifamily dwellings, maximum lot coverage and density to permit a density of 8 units where maximum allowed based on available land area would be 6 units. Variance to Article 2845, development of multifamily dwellings, building dimensions and separations to permit building and parking lot separations to be determined by the planning board where 15-foot separations are required between the building and the parking lots. Variance to Article 2877, parking area design standards, minimum aisle width to permit a parking lot aisle with 20 feet, width of 20 feet where 24-foot aisle width is required for two-way traffic. Can we ask those folks to shut that door? Variance to Article 2877, parking area design standards, parking restrictions in the required front yard to permit parking to be located within the required 15-foot front yard setback in a residential district for use other than a single or two-family. And finally, parking area design standards, setbacks from lot lines to permit parking lots and driveways within 5 feet of the southerly and westerly lot lines when a minimum 5-foot setback is required. All of these 8 variances would be at a property located at 12 Cross Street in Pennacook in an RN residential district. You swear to tell the truth and nothing?
Yes, I do.
May we have your name, please?
Nawaz Azam. And if I could just give a quick introduction here on this particular case. This is exactly what was heard and approved by the board back in February 4th, 2015.
I was going to say, I thought we
Yeah.
had this. It was the old school building, I believe?
Yep, a gentleman by the name of Higginbotham had gotten plans. He actually went through the planning board approval process.
Yep.
And the project floundered. And it could have been renewed. There may have been some miscommunications about the expiration of the variance versus the expiration of the planning board approvals. Thus, they did not come in and apply for an extension of the variance, but now they're back to reinstate the variance.
So these are the exact same variant, this is the same case?
Yes, it's exactly the same.
The same. Oh, you bought the place and wanted to take over the same plan?
Yes, I'm doing exactly the same. I already met with the code enforcement and Mr. Michael Santa and said everything is going to be the same. I already have a builder, and we would like to, start on it right away. And I'm sure if you had a chance to take a look on the landscaping plans, right now the whole lot is paved, and we plan to decrease it to 16 parking spots and convert the rest into green area. gonna be a lot of landscaping, trees. We're gonna replace the fence. So these are actually all the original plans. They were approved by the previous owner.
Excellent.
Is there any change in the neighborhood?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Yeah, there's been no change to the zoning that would affect the property since that time either.
Apologies, when were they granted?
February of 2015.
Okay.
Variances are good for 2 years of the date of approval. So,
And then you can get,
a 1-year extension.
and that's the max you can
They
get.
let it go.
And it didn't happen.
So even if they got the extension, they'd be passed. Yeah.
True, yeah.
I
Any-
remember the case.
Any other questions for Mr. Azam? Anyone? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who wishes to be heard in favor of this appeal or in opposition to it? In favor? Do I have an in favor? Please come forward. I'm doing fine.
Here on the
You
urban
still
one.
do?
Just- I forgot my
You haven't
left
changed
on
from
the
before?
street. I left my right, you know what I mean? I thought I was gonna go to the street, but,
All right, Mr. Radley, how would you, what would you like us to know?
first of all, the building's in quite a distress out there. I think it should be granted on the fact that it's broken, which will increase the community a lot better. We actually live across the street. We purchased a house about 6 months ago, so I'd be a neighbor across the street. I think this time it's all, most of the houses in the neighborhood right now are multifamily homes. So I'd be definitely in favor of this project.
Very good. Do you live nearby?
I live right across the street, well, we own right across the street.
Okay.
15.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard? Any comments from code enforcement?
We got one more.
Oh, I'm sorry. You sat so far out there in the bleachers, I didn't see you.
Came in, it was pretty crowded.
Yeah. Doesn't look that way now, does it?
No,
You swear to tell the truth?
I do.
Would you give us your name for the record, please?
It's Kevin Hanks.
What would you like us to know, Mr. Hanks?
I live on an abutting piece of property to the school. I've been there almost 30 years. It's about probably 25 feet or so. I live on the Steeple View side. And when I was here for the last hearing, and essentially I have the same concerns. Where my property abuts, if the parking is within 5 feet of the westerly property line, the lights, the headlights, parking, everything is going to be essentially in my backyard, which is going to I was there at the time when it was a school. I do agree something needs to be done with it. The property is, so I'm not disputing the idea of putting something in there. It needs to be changed into a viable piece of property, but as I said, my concern is the privacy issue, the ability to be able to enjoy my own backyard without having cars parked facing into mine.
There's no fence or anything there currently?
It's a chain link fence that goes across there.
Is that yours or that's theirs?
The fence?
Is it your fence? Or it's their
No, it was there when I bought the property. I'm assuming it's a school because it goes the entire
fence? The
length.
old school's fence?
Yeah.
Or it's- okay, it's fine.
It goes around that whole
Oh, I
school
see.
property, so I'm assuming it's the school property
Is
or
that highlighted?
formally.
Yeah, that's his property. So if that was a privacy fence, would that address your concern?
Yes, if there was something there to block the,
The light, the
like I
noise.
said, the lights, the headlights, the noise.
Have you seen this plan?
I didn't know anything about this changing until I received the,
I guess it's the same plan that it's been since 2015, but there's no parking near your property.
Would cars be coming in that way along that fence?
I have a couple of pictures from my
He's on
backyard
Steeple
looking
View,
to
he
the
said.
school, if that helps.
Okay, this is a revised plan then from what was,
They're essentially the same picture.
Yeah, you should take a look at the plan
Mr. Hanks, because.
Come on over.
It's down here, because it's been revised since, I think, what went before the zoning board originally, where the driveway came around.
Maybe when it hit planning board, it got changed.
There's no cars
No one
coming.
No.
Right, so they moved all the parking up front into this area here.
So,
And you're
I'm sorry.
here.
I'm
You're here.
Okay,
Parking's up here on Summer Street.
okay.
There's no parking here, there's no way the cars are coming this way.
Okay, then,
This is all landscaping.
Yeah, because this was the original plan that came in with the, and that had the drive coming around the back,
Yeah.
right into your backyard, and then parking in like that, so they've eliminated
This
all
must,
that. I
this
think.
must be the result of the planning board's.
Must be.
Yeah, that's the
Convention.
approved plan, zoning, or planning board plan there.
okay, I have not seen this.
There's parking here.
Does that assuage your concerns?
Yes, the way I read, it said parking on the westerly side, which would be me, within 5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
That was my
It's
concern.
over here.
Okay, so it's up further.
Yep.
Okay, I don't think, I don't,
Yeah, I copied the language from the original application as brought in, not realizing it had changed in the planning. So if that's the plan being submitted to the board, that's what's going to be built.
Okay.
thank you.
You're welcome. Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard? Any comments from code enforcement?
Nothing more to add.
With that, we'll declare the public testimony portion of the hearing closed. We have a request to essentially renew a plan that was approved 3 years ago now, and with a modified site plan, which has addressed the neighbor's concern about headlights coming in his windows.
That has, I missed the end
Yes,
of
it
Mr.
did.
Hanks' comment.
Discussion?
Well, it's a very unique property because it's the old school. I mean, it's not going to be a single family. It's too large of a lot and too large of a building. So it's a very good design for trying to, improve a structure that otherwise has.
Yeah, no, I think as before, it's gonna be a good conversion and to a building that, it's a nice looking building. It just needs to be, something done to it before it falls down. So I'll make a motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The vote is unanimous. The variances are re-granted.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Just so I don't make the mistake the previous one I did. How long is this approval good for? Is it now 2 years or 1 year?
2 years.
2 years.
Because it's a new approval at this point.
All right. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Good luck.
Don't wait till the last minute.
No, it's gonna be done this year.
Okay. We'll be looking for it.
Thanks, Greg.
And now the moment you've all been waiting for, the last case this evening. 1918, Matthew J. Lear.
Or Mr. Lear.
This will be an easy one, I hope.
Sorry.
The applicant constructed an 8-foot by 20-foot, 5 by 1.5 foot, 1.5-inch farmer's porch with steps and requests an equitable waiver of dimensional regulations to grant legal status to a front setback of a recently constructed porch addition with a 46.9-foot setback for the porch and a 44.5-foot setback for the steps, where a setback of 50 feet is required by the table of dimensional regulations. If the board does not find that the criteria for an equitable waiver has been met, the applicant requests a variance to the table of dimensional regulations to grant legal status to a front setback of a recently constructed porch addition of 46.9 feet setback for the porch and 44.5 foot to the steps, where the front setback of 50 feet is required and a side setback of 33.4 feet is required. 33.4 where a side setback of 40 feet is required.
And that would apply to the equitable waiver request too. That last sentence got left off the waiver.
All right. And all this happens at 90 West Parish Road in an RO residential district. Do you just swear to tell the truth?
I do.
It's just you and me here. Would you give us your name as you testify, please?
Matthew Lear. So the question is, as you just said, was if we could leave the farmer's porch as it newly is built. We did not build it with ill intent. It was approved and stamped plans. It was actually found by the bank During the loan process, they sent a non-certified surveyor out. I had given the building department, a year ago, I had done my leach field and septic in preparation for the addition. We upgraded and they went off those prints. It was just missed. The bank caught it prior to Ted leaving. He was who I approached, and we're where we are now.
So the question here is this really eligible for an equitable waiver of dimensional regulations, or does it require the variance? And the question comes under, I think he meets all the other criteria, except for the second portion of the equitable waiver, where you have to demonstrate the violation was caused by either a good faith error in measurement or calculation made by an owner or an owner's agent, or by an error in interpretation or administration of this ordinance by the code administrator. And the question is Ted may have missed the fact that the setback was deficient, but that's not necessarily an administrative interpretation error. So I'm not sure if it really qualifies for the equitable waiver. If it doesn't, then we need to take a look at the variance criteria.
But didn't we also hear testimony that someone made a mistake, a surveyor made a mistake in measuring?
No, the surveyor came out after the fact.
The bank sent their surveyor to close our construction loan. They're the ones that caught it. So that's what set this ball in motion. And that's why I'm here tonight, is to just clarify it. And
I mean, so it was an existing building, you put the garage, I've watched it, I've driven by a million times.
so the old house is 8 feet. I mean, you can see the old house is the one close to the 8-foot property line.
Yep.
Both neighbors left and right of me, the farmhouse and farmer's porch is maybe 10 feet off the road.
The brown house looks like it's way closer than.
And my other neighbor, her brown house is about 30 feet. We're, set back from them. And what's funny, or not funny, was the actual drawing of the porch was supposed to be 10 feet out. For cost savings, we did 8, not knowing any of this.
Right.
The only issue is where the piers are. If this wasn't granted, I would end up having to tear the porch down. It was $18,000 to build the farmer's porch. It's not like I can just cut it back. It would be a disassemble and rebuild, so the hardship would be.
Did you have a builder's permit for this?
Yes.
So
it is, this whole project is finished at this point.
So wait, Craig, you're saying that your issue may be with part 1B because
that was
there was not an issue, it was not a problem with the measurement?
That's what it looked like before you bought it.
Yeah, I was gonna say that was pre-me, yeah.
It's all cleaned up now.
Yeah, no, it's
anyway,
beautiful.
Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, can you just kind of repeat, just dumb down what you had said earlier?
If there's an occasion where perhaps you did have a surveyor, or perhaps you measured it out yourself, and the roadway was not marked properly or something of that nature, and you made an honest mistake, that's grounds for granting the equitable waiver. Or if you come to the building inspector or zoning administrator, and I mistakenly say, it's a 40-foot front setback as opposed to a 50-foot setback, then they're relying on my information at that point in time, and then I think that would be eligible. But where it seems to have just been a missed opportunity, I'm not so sure that it's eligible.
So neither of those.
So
things
you would like to go with number 2, is what you're saying?
I think it would be safer for the applicant to.
Well, in that case, that's what we ought to do.
Okay. So
go to part 2 of the equitable waiver.
No, it's the
number
variance.
2, a variance to Article 28-4-1.
I think that'd give the bank more comfort too, if that's.
Table of dimensional.
Yeah.
Regulations.
Well, we've granted variances in similar situations in the past, where it was an innocent mistake and an equitable waiver didn't exactly fit.
Yeah. And so in this situation, I think it was and porch is already built. It looks nice. I think it was an honest mistake.
And even if they were coming to us prospectively, I think it's a reasonable use of the property to have a porch of that size. It's a pretty minimal.
I'm concerned the neighbors are also a lot closer, so that's.
And we got a lot of people in opposition.
Don't they all have farmers' porches, is that what you were saying, or just that they're that close to the road?
I think the other house is actually closer.
Yeah, I mean,
so in terms
the
of
oldest house
the
on the
structure
road,
being
yeah.
close, it's not out of the character.
Yeah, the structure being close makes it a unique. So I'd move to approve the variance.
Seconded.
Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The variance is granted. Your porch is legal.
Thank you.
Just in time.
Made an honest porch of it.
Yes, you did.
Is there anything else? Do we need to approve the minutes from last time? No, do we need to?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The minutes are approved.
Got a mess here.
Yeah, I'm leaving it till tomorrow.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and thank you, Rose.
Better text Mike. I might
We got
be
through
late.
it, Chris.
We did get through it.
Kind of powered through.